So welcome to this conference on methane, methane and natural gas, big topics right now. We have a Europe that's looking to reduce its emissions, also from fossil fuels. Europe that's looking to end its dependency on Russian gas completely. We want to provide lower energy prices to businesses and citizens. And we're looking to close an LNG trade deal with the US. And somehow all of these priorities have to fit together into a neat package that ticks all of the above boxes. And so this conference feels very timely because I think these are all topics that we're going to end up addressing today in one way or another. My name is Sonja van Rensen. I'm here to moderate this afternoon for you. I'm a long-time energy, climate, environment journalist here in Brussels, and I'm Chief Strategy Officer at Carbon Pulse since last summer. Carbon Pulse is a news agency specialized in reporting on carbon markets and increasingly also the broader net zero agenda and emerging biodiversity markets. So we have a team of reporters. A handful of us are based in Brussels, and I have colleagues of mine reporting on these issues day to day. So we split today into several parts. We're going to kick off in a moment with a series of introductory speeches. We're going to have a small fireside chat as well with today's event partner Attributes, which you can see up there. And then we're going to have three panel discussions. The first focused on tackling methane emissions, and we're going to look at that from a global perspective. We're going to have a second panel focused on demand, who's investing in methane emission reductions, who's interested in buying gas with reduced methane emissions. And finally, we're going to have a panel focused more on the practicalities of delivering that. So how do we certify certain attributes, in this case, especially methane emissions associated with natural gas, and how do we then also move that certification down the value chain so that it ultimately ends up at the end user who's hopefully interested in purchasing that product. We will make time for questions. It's purely physical here today, so if you've got questions, please put up your hands, and we'll try and take those. They'll probably be for the panels, not the keynotes, just to ensure that we actually make it through our panels and finish at 6 p.m. Later this afternoon. I think that's probably it from me. I'm going to hand over to Eurogas's president, Cristian Signoretto. He's also Deputy COO for Natural Resources and Director for Global Global Gas and LNG Markets at Eni. And he's going to give you a welcome to this afternoon.
Thank you, Sonja, for your introduction, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to welcome you here at this conference, and thank you for joining us. Well, reducing methane emissions in the energy sector is surely one of the most immediate and effective ways to cut greenhouse gas footprint. And it's a priority that we fully support in practice everywhere. It's also essential because natural gas will be a core part of Europe's energy future for the years to come. And at a global level, natural gas consumption is still very much on a growing side. So tackling the life cycle emission of global gas is surely crucial to make sure that this commodity does not hurt the environment. But on the other hand, also we need to be practical. So this is not a challenge that Europe can win on itself. In fact, most of our gas is imported. And if we fail to address the emissions across the entire value chain, from upstream to downstream, we risk falling short of our objectives, regardless of how strict the rules that we're setting for ourselves in Europe. Eurogas supports the environmental ambition of regulating methane emission in its goal. Absolutely. We just want to raise our concern around how we implement it. We want to make sure that we implement it the right way, for us and from the industries. And in that regard, trust, transparency, and credible data are essential. And today, there is still a long way to go on that direction. Data quality and availability are significantly different from each other. measurement, reporting, and verification are inconsistent sometimes. And this actually does not help to create confidence. And the EU methane regulation is a key step forward in the industry. And I think this is true, and everybody in the world recognizes that. But again, the implementation will be challenging for importers, and we need to make it right. In their current form, the reporting obligation on EU importers are quite simply unworkable. Importers are being held responsible for information and data that in most cases they cannot access. And in other cases, those information and data are not yet clearly defined, also because the relevant implementation guidelines are still missing. These requirements are already causing some difficulties for contracting new contracts, for new supply contracts to Europe, and could become even more problematic when with deadlines actually coming forward. So if we fail to clarify and make this provision workable, we run the risk of undermining the objective of the regulation. And in the worst case, actually, we might even, let's say, affect the security of supply of Europe, jeopardizing the diversification and making gas even less affordable than we want to. So we outlined these concerns in our letter that we sent to EU institutions, not because we want to push back against this ambition. I think this is completely wrong. The fact is that we want just to highlight what needs to be done correctly in order to make sure that not only Europe, but I think all the world would follow us. So for us, a phased implementation is key, with clear guidance and support. Companies need time to adjust, and regulators also time to make sure that they can build up their competencies in this field. And we must not deter Europe to sign new contracts in this moment in which we dearly need them. Our collective task is to make this work, build trust, and create certification tools that can work globally. It won't be easy, but it's necessary. And that's why today's conference, I think, matters. We have brought together regulators, industry leaders, technology providers, NGOs, international partners, because only together we can solve these issues, and also engage in producing countries through diplomacy, which is going to be important if you want to make it right again. So in particular, I'm delighted to also have here today as keynote speakers Dita Jorgensen and Jutta Paulus, which we gratefully thank for being here with us today, and I join you in the audience in order to also follow the interesting panels that we are going to lay ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. I think some clear questions from the outset. I'd like to welcome directly then Dita Jorgensen, who's here as our keynote speaker today, Director General for Energy at the European Commission, a function she's been in for the past 5-6 years now, has been for the Commission far longer than that, with a lot of experience, particularly on trade, but also working on competition issues as head of cabinet for Margrethe Vestager previously. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for the kind welcome. Christian, thank you very much for the welcome. Distinguished guests, colleagues and friends. Thank you very much to Eurogas for having organized this timely and highly topical event. The event is topical. The title is very precise as well: driving change, building trust and creating value. I think if you look around in today's geopolitical environment, we all see the challenges, we see the uncertainty, we see the rapid change, we see the lack of predictability, we see the high levels of risks that follow from that. And to drive change, rather than just trying to follow and adapt to change, we need to make sure that we work together. That will allow us to create value, and it will also help us build trust, and it will require trust. In this global reality of uncertainty, we see Europe as a beacon of predictability, certainty. Europe is an active proponent and engager in cooperation. We're open for business and we're open for international partnerships. We have set ourselves a very clear direction towards decarbonizing our economy and our energy system and being climate neutral by 2050. We stay that course. And we do that obviously for the climate, but we do it also for our economy, for our competitiveness, and we do it for our security. And we know that investments into the energy system, into clean energy and into related infrastructure is a necessary part of that transition and of that security, competitiveness and climate objective. We also know that alongside the clean energy, as you have just said in your opening, we will continue to need gas as part of the European energy system in the decades ahead as part of this transition. So we have put in place a clear regulatory framework for that. We have got the gas market legislation. And then, of course, we have the methane regulation. And so let me turn to that, still looking at it within your headline, within the subject of today, driving change, building trust, and creating value. Because in the field of methane emissions, we need to be driving change. The need for change is clear and it is urgent. We've seen the latest global methane tracker from the International Energy Agency. It was released just last week. And it states very clearly that because of record production of oil, gas, and coal in the last year, combined with limited mitigation efforts, methane emissions have kept rising and they're now above 120 million tons annually. This represents almost a third of total methane emissions from human activity, represented once again in the energy sector alone. And this underlines the importance of methane emission reduction. The good thing is, of course, that we can do something about it. And it makes sense to do something about it, both from an emissions perspective, but again, also from a security and economic perspective. As you have said in your introduction, the European Methane Regulation is the first of its kind and the most comprehensive and ambitious one. When we implement this regulation, we can help drive change across the European Union, but also globally, in close cooperation with our international partners and suppliers. So our leadership, European Union leadership, private and public sector, is more central than ever. According to the International Energy Agency, methane emissions from the energy sector has risen, as I said, but we also see that it is estimated to be underreported in most parts of the world. And that brings us to the question of trust, of building trust. We need to make sure that we have clarity and insights into what is actually happening. And the methane regulation sets obligations on measuring, reporting, and abatement of methane emissions. In addition to that, we have requirements for independent verification and publication of emissions data, and that will contribute to building trust, improving transparency and data. The key objective is to make sure that we have that evidence on our methane emissions so that we can act on an informed and objective basis and give certainty to the markets through that. So the success of our methane regulation depends really on the implementation and on the credibility of meeting the objectives of the actions we are taking, of the measurability. I know that you in the gas industry understand this, and I know that you're ready to deliver. We have had good engagement so far, and we look forward to that continued engagement around the implementation of the methane regulation. So we are more than ready to work with you. We are keen to work with you, with all stakeholders, so that we bring as much clarity, trust, predictability, certainty, also in this area of the European Union Common Framework. I also know that for the sector, one of the biggest challenges is the need to find a credible traceability solution for the natural gas supply chains, and that is of critical importance for us as well, because we want a regulation that delivers, a regulation that works. So again, happy to work with you, look forward to engaging with you for viable practical solutions in line with the requirements of the regulation. That can also help us demonstrate the gain from your hard work over the last years, reducing the methane intensity in your production and supply chains, and it can help us take advantage of the new opportunities that are opened by the methane regulation. And that brings me to the last part of your title, the creating value part of it. Again, as highlighted by the International Energy Agency, obligations of the regulation are based on industry best practices, and these offer companies a competitive advantage due to the higher value of gas and the comparably low cost of abatement in this particular sector when it comes to methane. We're also convinced that demand for more transparency on the methane emissions from the supply chains of both oil, gas, and coal will grow in global energy markets. EU companies that have higher transparency and lower intensity levels above the average operator globally will therefore be at a comparative advantage. And of course, our market, the European Union market, will remain highly attractive for global suppliers of LNG. This is all the more important in light of developments these past 3 years since the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, and with our decision to start phasing out Russian energy imports. We have, over those 3 years, become the single largest off-taker of LNG globally. We presented just last week a repower roadmap that sends a clear signal of our continued commitment and readiness to act, including by legislative proposals in the coming months, in order to phase out the remaining Russian energy in our system. And so that means we will be even more relevant as an off-taker for global LNG to replace the natural gas that is currently imported from Russia. So, to conclude, I'm sure that we together can solve the remaining uncertainties, that we can bring clarity for an effective, credible, predictable regulatory framework also for methane, and of course a framework that works in practice, that works on the ground, so it brings the result that we're trying to achieve. So I hope that we can continue on this path jointly, working together, driving change, building trust, and creating value for a strong Europe. And on that note, I thank you for your time and for the invitation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, and also for striking, I guess, a collaborative and positive note in what are challenging times. I guess everyone here in the room looks forward to working with you on taking forward this agenda. Our next speaker is going to pick up on some of the points you mentioned: creating value, also building trust. I'd like to welcome Simone Pugliese, CEO of Attributes. He's going to tell you a bit more about Attributes in a moment, but Simone himself has a long career in investment banking, has also worked on strategy with Schlumberger, and was one of the co-founders of Kairos, which is today a leader in the space of intelligence on environmental and climate intelligence. He's also worked in the venture capital space, but what he's going to do here for you is pick up indeed on that need for data and talk a little bit about energy, data, his own personal journey from one to the other, and how you bring those two together to ultimately create trust that ultimately underpins value creation and, well, future business as well. Go ahead.
So thank you for the introduction, and thanks to Eurogas and the team for welcoming us on stage. I think it's funny to see how in the very good initial speeches, there were few words that were quite recurrent, and it was about transparency and robustness and data. And actually, I want to start sharing with you a very personal anecdote, which is I knew nothing about methane, okay? So quite openly, the first time we heard about methane was in 2010 in Schlumberger. We were in West Africa, and we were looking at flaring issues for a European operator in that area. Actually, a couple of colleagues from that time are here in the room with me. And actually, everybody back then was focused, as you might well remember, 15 years ago, on CO2. And then we started looking into actually the real impact of methane on the global emissions and the role that the energy industry played into that. You're all experts, so I'm not going to replay the message. We started to look at it like, allow me the cliche, like a low-hanging fruit. So basically, we understood that it was relatively easy and concentrated to try to adopt new measures for methane, and many of the technologies to mitigate actually methane emissions were already developed and was becoming more of a matter of deployment rather than R&D. Fast forward a few years, I took a completely different take on the problem, and a few of us, among which Antoine, who will be on stage a bit later, we decided to combine our experience in the energy sector to actually look at the data problem. And that led to the creation of a company, Kairos, which was one of the first, probably in our view the first, to provide methane measurements based on satellite signals and imagery. Beyond our personal story there, that unlocked a completely new way to actually look at global issues for the energy sector by bringing, and here I paraphrase again what's said before, more transparency, traceability, and accountability in that case, on the data that was being generated. So back then, 2015, we were really focused on generating new data sets to address an issue for which the industry was to some extent myopic, just because the data was lacking. So that was quite an interesting point of view. And I think the bridge comes from the fact to where we stand today, that at this stage or at this point in time, we believe that there has been a very positive proliferation of new data sets. And actually, new data is required to take good decisions. Now, if you extrapolate from methane and we look at, let's call it energy transition at large, you can check very different scenarios built by IMF and the Goldmans and you name it. And all of them actually size the capital expenditure required to get really close, or as close as possible, to a net zero scenario in 2050, in the order of anywhere in between 100 to 200 trillion over the next 25 years. So if you make a quick math, that's sometimes could be somewhere in between 5 to 10 trillion per year. Actually, that's almost war-like economy, except the US maybe had some spikes over the year 42, 43 last century, but really it's deploying 10, 15% of the world GDP every year for that. And you have to solve three puzzles. One is the technological puzzle. So as I said, you need to make sure you develop and deploy pertinent technologies. The second one is the data puzzle. You need to make sure that you have good data upon which you can act. You can plan, you can measure, you can track, you can change, and to solve the final puzzle, which is really the capital allocation. Obviously, all of that is in a context in which we need to work together, the private industry, the new technologies, and the regulator. I think we're very lucky to be today in Europe, as Europe has already played a role at the forefront of novel regulation for new sectors. And I lived it myself firsthand with the GDPR. So GDPR, as boring as it might sound, was actually a very, very, very good set of laws and regulation that helped us back in 2016 deal with the new data sets that were available and has now become a global standard for data governance. It was rolled out in between 2016 and 2018. And I think that's quite important because actually methane regulation is going to play the same role. So we're taking the forefront on the global stage, showing that also from Europe we can have innovative legislation beyond of technologies and companies. And actually we need to make sure that actually there is a clear view on mitigation, on reduction, that again, among many other things, has to be data enabled. And the data angle here, it's quite important because we need to make sure that thanks to that gas, and here I'm talking to a gas audience, although I come more from a crude background, but it's true that we make sure that gas will stay as an active part of the energy mix of the future and will become a solution, or is becoming a solution, rather than a problem to deal with. On the data aspect, which has been the path I've took for the last 10 years or more, as I said before, at some point I was personally really interested and focused on how to generate new data sets. Today you have a plethora of new sensors, whether these are on the ground or on the sky, flying around, or on the orbits, like the satellites on orbit. But I think the other aspect today is more like, how do we actually make sure that all these new data sets are robust, they're pertinent, they're accurate, and above all, they're securely transferred. So this is the key topic for me today that the industry has to deal with to make sure that we use this data in the right way to meet the challenges that are provided by both the regulation and the market. In that sense, there is one aspect that is key. It's about the robustness and security, because obviously it's good to have a strategic view on the data, but we need to make sure that this data will be well integrated into all the workflows, whether these are financial, regulatory, compliance, risk management, or for reporting. If we look, if I extend the analogy of GDPR with the methane regulation, I think we have 2-3 years ahead of us to validate how we adapt to that regulation, how it comes into play. But again, the real topic today for that regulation is really about compliance. So we need to make sure we are compliant. That will lead to situations where you will have license to operate under that. And finally, there could be other rewards for the industry if people behave, or operators or investors behave in that context. And what's really key on that topic is actually to make sure that we move from a space where we actually reporting per se becomes collaboration, and it brings value into what is to be done. But let's not underestimate the fact that it's a regulation that it's been rolled out, and we will have to deal with secure and trusted data to make sure that also on the way we will adjust any delta that we might perceive in between the perceived impact or the expected impact and what's really happening. So that should be really the focus now, is to start simple, be pragmatic, focus on compliance. You can move to license to operate, and there could be more benefits coming down the way. And I think that probably the key message here is that we want to make sure we create a context in which good players will be rewarded for good behavior. And that should be the ultimate goal of regulation. Now, the good news is that I believe that most of the people in this room are good players. So I really hope that in the future you will reap all the benefits from following that. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So Simone is going to stay up here. I'm going to move across. We're going to have a short one-on-one between Simone and Antoine Half, who used to work together at Kairos, because Antoine is the other co-founder of Kairos. Is also its chief analyst. So as you just heard, Kairos is a big company that uses AI to basically analyze satellite data at large scale and use that to generate information about everything from physical risks to the global energy supply chain to the environment. And what they were going to do here was talk a little bit more about methane management, the possibilities for that with the latest technology, and also ultimately how you mitigate. Antoine has a very illustrious background in the energy sector. I'm not going to reel off everything he's done, but trust me, it's a lot. He's worth looking up. But he was once upon a time also the chief oil analyst at the International Energy Agency, for example, and has also worked at the US Energy Information Administration, amongst other things. And I'll mention just a third, was director of the global energy practice at the Eurasia Group, amongst other things, as I say. So looking forward to, a very interesting conversation.
Thank you. So thank you for the introduction, and thanks for avoiding me having to go through the very extensive CV of Antoine, which is really cumbersome. I think it's always a pleasure. Thank Antoine for joining us here.
Thank you.
I believe that the way I would have presented Antoine, obviously he has played a key role in the industry over the last 30 years, as you said, in business, academia, with Columbia still today, consulting, media. But what brought us together was 10 years ago, the idea with other people, which is not the two of us, to actually start using new data sets, generating new data based on satellite signals with the purpose of bringing transparency for the industry. And one of the first user cases that we developed was methane. And here maybe the first question to you, Antoine, is would be, how do you see, or how do you think the methane measurements landscape has evolved over the last 10 years?
Thank you. Thanks, Simone. First of all, thanks for having me here. And thanks very much for the very generous introduction. I was blushing. The landscape is unrecognizable. Like when we started 10 years ago, there was nothing out there. We started right after the Paris Agreement of 2015. And the Paris Agreement, if you recall, everybody knew that methane concentrations were rising in the atmosphere, but there was no methane reduction target in the Paris Agreement, for the simple reason that we could not actually detect methane emissions, let alone measure them or attribute them to their sources. The 2012 methane regulations in the Obama administration were mandating the use of OGI cameras, which are very expensive and don't tell you much. So it's a completely different landscape today. There's a proliferation of technologies. We at Kairos, we started by tapping into constellations that were in orbit, and we extracted a lot of methane information from them, Sentinel-5P, but also Sentinel-2, Sentinel-3. We now exploit imagery from 14 different constellations, and that's rapidly rising. We're going to have a 15th very soon. The resolution is now falling down to 3.7 meters. Spatially, the detection threshold is going down to 30 kilos an hour. So it's amazing change. There's aerial surveys, there's in-situ sensors, and the proliferation of companies like ours, not only upstream but also downstream processing, interpreting the data. And we've moved from a situation where there was a scarcity of intelligence and data to a situation where there's almost a surplus or excess of data, which can be bewildering and confusing. And our role at Chaos increasingly is not just to provide data and aggregate data from multiple sources, but also to help our clients navigate this proliferation, this very complex landscape of multiple measurements, different instruments measuring different things for different purposes.
So in this new landscape, how do you see different stakeholders across the value chain dealing with this data, and do they have different expectations?
Yeah, well, I think all the key stakeholders are embracing the new technologies. When it comes to satellite detections, I think are not the entirety of monitoring, but a foundational piece. There's been very early adoption by regulators. That's probably been one of the first sectors to adopt new technologies, especially in the EU. And the EU has been at the front end of leveraging these technologies to implement and to design new regulations to abate methane. But we've seen adoption in the US as well. When John Kerry announced the Global Methane Pledge in Glasgow, he used a map that we had put together with the Washington Post of Russian emissions. So clearly the satellite monitoring was really unlocked new regulatory opportunities that were quickly tapped. The US now is maybe a little bit on hold. Still early to know where it's going to go. But as the US is taking a little bit of a backseat, we see other countries like China rising to the plate and claiming more leadership roles. Same in East Asia, all over the world. Users, importers are also warming up to this. The financial sector is turning out to be a key player, and we have a partnership with BNP Paribas where we help them monitor the methane footprint of their portfolio companies, and they're working to figure out how to build this data into their workflows and their lending practices. We see a lot of awareness now in the public, and we've worked with the media, with Bloomberg News, the Washington Post I mentioned before, with the Guardian, other media outfits. So there's clearly more awareness of the risks of rising methane emissions and of the sources. And the last sector, I think, that's been probably the most ambivalent about full transparency has been the industry itself. Initially, when we started, there was a little bit of pushback from companies that our data suggested were emitting much more than what they were reporting themselves. I think for all of us who came from an oil and gas background, the amount of detection that we made came as a surprise. So understandably, there was a little bit of a initial pushback, but we're now beyond that. And now the industry is, the accuracy, the robustness of the methodologies and the science behind all the detection technologies has been clearly established. Blind studies have confirmed the accuracy of measurements. The methodologies have been peer-reviewed in Science and Nature and other journals. So we see a lot more adoption now from the industry.
Thanks. So one of the aspects we have seen also is like you have new sensors also on the ground, and you have companies typically like Schlumberger and Honeywell, etc., even developing their own sensor for methane. That raises a few questions about the methodology, the bottom-up, the top-down, level of aggregation, and that creates a lot of discrepancy both in between methodologies, sensors, but also reported versus measured observed data. What's your take on that, and how should these discrepancies be managed by the industry and regulators?
Yeah, well, as you say, there's a big gap between typically what's reported and what's observed from space. I think the good news is that that gap is starting to narrow. So if you look at the trajectory of reporting under OGMP 2.0, initially when companies moved from the low level to mid-level, the reported emissions went down because companies were becoming more aware of the problem of methane emissions and were seizing low-hanging fruits and reducing their emissions, but their capacity to monitor, detect, assess emissions was also limited. Now, as more and more companies are reaching level 5, we see a rebound in the level of reported emissions as they now report at the asset levels, do not just rely on emission factors for areas that assets are not directly monitored, and they include more technologies and include more satellite imaging. So that rebound, I think, suggests that we're heading in the right direction. We're coming together. That's extremely encouraging. But there's still a very wide gap. There's still a long ways to go. I think what I would say about this issue is that there's one level, there's an issue of space, of scale. You can look at emissions at the asset level, the company level. You can look at it at the national level, which is the way governments report to the UNFCCC and the level that's considered by many regulations, national methane intensities. And you can look at the basin level. And I think at the basin level, there's no controversy about what emission levels are. There's much more agreement. But there's also very significant differentiation within countries across basins. So if you look, for example, in the US, a gas basin like the Haynesville has a much lower methane intensity for gas than an oil basin, a predominantly oil basin like the Permian. So the two basins should not be painted with the same brush. Similarly in Algeria, which is one of the highest emitters on the highest intensity as a country, huge discrepancy, huge disparity between fields that are operated by Sonatrach and fields that are operated by Equinor or BP, two ends of the scale. So I think in the interest of accuracy, fairness, rewarding operators, positive discrimination, favoring the rightful, responsible operators, it's important to move down from the national level of reporting to the basin level of reporting. And here, there's not much space for disagreement.
Thank you, Antoine. And just as a closing question, how do you think the new measurements are changing the outcomes of the industry? What would be the role in the methane EU regulation in that? And how do you see the behavior changing across different regions, namely the US, Europe, and Asia?
So how is it changing the industry? It's not changing it fast enough, because if we look at the direction of methane emissions, we're still rising. Well, the methane intensity is not rising necessarily everywhere, but the aggregate level of emissions is still moving in the wrong direction, so that suggests the impact has not been sufficient, although perhaps it takes time for some measures and some policies to actually yield concrete results. But on the positive note, I think we see more and more actors acting in a responsible way and communicating about their responsible behavior in a trusted way. One example I would bring is Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia was reporting methane emissions to the UNFCCC at a certain level, which was widely adjusted upwards by the IEA methane tracker a few years back until last year, and EDGAR in the EU. We had a partnership with CAPSARC. We looked at methane emissions in Saudi from oil and gas as well as waste. From oil and gas, what we measured from space was actually extremely similar to what the Saudis were reporting, which is a very low level of emissions, one of the lowest levels by industry standards, second lowest after Norway, I think, or something like that. And the good news is that this very good behavior, and also the efforts by the Saudis to get recognition for this good behavior, is inspiring other countries in the region to follow suit. And we've seen first the UAE rise to the occasion and significantly reduce their footprint in 2022, and then 23, and then last year we saw Kuwait, which had been still emitting at a reasonably high level, bring down those emissions and dramatically reduce its footprint in 2024. So this is spreading, and hopefully we're going to see other countries follow suit. But for good performers, in this case countries, but also companies, there's some inhibition, some barriers to lead by example for various reasons. But once a company jumps and takes a stance and leads by example, the rewards are coming, and I think that's very encouraging. Now, in terms of where we should take, what this means for policies, I think we have to be very open-minded and very flexible. Regulations are still in their early days. We're just looking to implement the EU methane regulations. But we have to keep in mind, this is the first iteration of a policy process, which probably will have several iterations. And we're going to find out that some things work, or something works well, and others don't work as well. Some things impose a heavy burden, a reporting burden on industry and governments, others don't. And I think what we have to do is be very flexible, adjust policies as time goes by, as we learn from experience, and discard whatever doesn't have a big payoff, whatever is more red tape than actual abatement, and then amplify things that have a big impact, that may not be very taxing in terms of reporting burden, but are very effective in terms of bringing the footprint down and bending the curve of climate change. So we have to change that. And the last point I would make is, as we look at reporting on the footprint and the intensity of what we trade across borders, I think it's going to be important for not to rely on a single registry from a single country, but to have registries from different countries. For example, not just from the US, which is an exporter of LNG, but also registries based in the EU, which are the importing country. We have to have some verifiability, some redundancy in the system, and ideally it would be great to have interoperability between these different platforms, different registries, so that they can be integrated and brought together by the regulators.
Excellent. Thank you, Antoine. I don't know if we can take any question from the audience, or we're done. We hope to be back in 2027 and 2030 to see how the methane regulation is being adopted. And it almost looked like we didn't rehearse yesterday in a beautiful Sunday afternoon. So thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much to both of you. I think we won't open for questions, but no, we won't, sorry. Will you both be around for the rest of the afternoon? Okay, so I'd advise you to seek them out over coffee if you have follow-up questions. We've got one panel between now and our coffee break, and so I'd like to welcome up Kitty, Thomas, Masataka, and Jonathan, and I'll give you each an introduction. I'll move out of the way. So you're welcome to take a seat. Let's use these chairs that we're all reasonably close to one another. I'll sit on the end. You can sit where you like.
Do we fill the chairs? No.
Okay. So we've got about 45 minutes for this panel, and we'll end it at about 3:30. So we have time for a coffee before the next two panels. I'll be brief in my intros to give you a chance to listen to the people who have more interesting things to say than I have. So next to me is Kitty Nitre, Head of Unit for Decarbonization and Sustainability of Energy Sources at DG Energy, so a colleague of Ditte's, who we heard from earlier. She previously worked in Kadri Simpson's cabinet, so for the Energy Commissioner, notably on energy system integration, hydrogen, and also the EU's methane emission strategy. And she was also a member of Commissioner Arias Cañete back when he was Energy and Climate Commissioner, and has been with DG Energy, so working on energy issues for longer than that, also on state aid issues, for example. Next to her, we have Jonathan Stern. So Jonathan's founded the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies Gas Research Program back in 2003, became a distinguished fellow in 2016, and is also an honorary professor at the Centre for Energy, Petroleum and Mining Law and Policy at the University of Dundee. And he's a distinguished research fellow at the Institute of Energy Economics in Japan. Someone who's done a lot of work looking at life cycle analysis of natural gas, also been involved in US natural gas, looking at methane emissions along that whole value chain, and has authored numerous books and papers on the subject. Next to him, we have Thomas de Oliveira Breidariol, an energy and environmental policy analyst at the IEA, and someone who's led the IEA's work on methane emissions. So that's including, I imagine, the tracker update that came out last week, and that work also feeds into the IEA's World Energy Outlook. And, well, he's done a lot of work on, I would say, the oil and gas sector more broadly, and previously worked at the Brazilian Institute of the Environment and Renewable Natural Resources, working on things like environmental impact assessments. And finally, last but not least, Masataka Yarita, Director of the LNG and Methane Management Division at the Business Strategy Department at the Japan Organization for Metals and Energy Security, JOGMEC, which is a Japanese government independent, administrative independent institution, but originally brought together the Japanese National Oil Company and Metals and Mining Agency. And he's done a lot of work in JOGMEC, also on methane specifically, has led the methane management efforts across that organization, and previously also worked at the IEA as a stocks and demand analyst. So again, someone with a long experience, notably in the oil and gas business. So what we wanted to do was, in this panel was, I think, it's the broadest of the three panels. It's global in scope. There's a lot of big topics to discuss. Was give you each a chance to kick off with just a few minutes on how you see, I suppose, the state of, let's say, methane in the world today from your respective positions. I propose we kick off either with you, Kitty, or with Thomas. Don't know if you have a preference.
Maybe Thomas, because I've heard so much about the EU methane
Yeah,
regulation.
since we just had the update last week. If you want to kick off, and then maybe we'll come to you on how EU policy, what the latest is there, and how you're going to be building on what he tells us. Go ahead.
Great, sounds good. Very warm welcome to everyone, and thank you very much for the invitation today. I think there are three key messages in my head. They are all in the Global Methane Tracker we released last week. First is that we have a problem, emissions are not going down. This might sound a bit like a broken record, something we have said in the past, but every time we look at the data, and there has been increasing amounts of data, of measurement data available, we see that emissions are not falling. This isn't to say that there hasn't been any progress. Our latest estimate indicate that there's been a reduction in the upstream intensities of oil and gas of about 10%. So there's been an improvement in performance over the past 5 years of about 10%. The problem is that this has come along increasing oil and gas production and also increasing emissions from abandoned facilities. We should not forget those closed oil and gas wells that might still be leaking or emitting some methane emissions. There's a lot of uncertainty there, certainly, but emissions are not falling, and this is something that we need to change. So my second message is that there are many good reasons for us to work on that change. Methane abatement is one of the very few areas where we see an alignment between climate action, energy security, and affordability. Now, this might come to a surprise to some of you. Well, climate action, yes, obviously. Energy security, okay, maybe, but affordability. So we had a very close look this year at what would be the impact on oil and gas prices of implementing a small tax on methane, $20 per ton of CO2 equivalent. That would be enough to drive about 90% or even a bit more than that of the abatement options in the oil and gas sector. And the impact on prices would be roughly 0.5%. So that's next to nothing. And that's not even taking into account that this methane abatement would bring additional natural gas to markets and would ease the supply-demand balance and could even, in the end, keep prices at the same level or even reduce them. And the third message that I want to start with and to share with you is that we do have a number of reasons to be hopeful. We have heard about the EU regulation. We will, I believe, soon hear about the efforts from Japan and Korea on the clean initiative. There's a lot of talk about an international harmonized system for measurement, monitoring, reporting, and verification. But it's not only this. We are seeing a lot of action between consumers, buyers, producers, a lot of voluntary action from the industry. Certainly, there's a lot of uncertainty about what will happen in the United States. There have been deregulatory initiatives there. We should all acknowledge that. But at the same time, nearly half of the oil and gas production in the United States comes from companies that have a pledge to near zero methane emissions, right? There are a lot of state-level regulations that will likely remain in place. There's a lot of opportunities in the oil and gas value chain to reduce emissions cost-effectively. So even companies that are not particularly interested in it for the climate benefits might still go after the economic benefits of methane abatement. So there are a lot of good reasons to think that we will continue to see momentum to drive down methane emissions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that intro. I think we'll go straight. We'll give you each a chance to speak, and then we can follow up on some of the points you raised. So come to you next. I think Kitty, and maybe, obviously a comment on what we just heard. I think interesting to hear. So what's next on the EU methane regulation? We heard in the opening. We heard a few things. One, I heard the word unworkable, and two, that it might make it actually more difficult to negotiate supply contracts when obviously we're looking to move away from Russian gas, and therefore, we need these new contracts. And also just in part because of how it's set up, but in part also because there are still gaps in how it's going to work. And I guess very practically, what direction are you looking to take this regulation in? When can we see some more decisions? And how will you, or how are you doing that in parallel to negotiating with the US and ultimately looking to get access to their LNG?
Thank you very much. So maybe also an important part that I didn't put in my bio, that I started in the Commission on security of gas supply. So that was my very first job. And just to reassure everyone that this is absolutely something that I've always been mindful and will be mindful, because that's somehow where I started. But at the same time, I think it was very interesting to hear the speakers before us, because I would like to really just summarize the key points which really set the backdrop for what we are trying to do here. The first one is that while the EU is on its path to climate neutrality, it will still need natural gas, and it needs to import that natural gas because EU production is declining. So I think this already is a very important point, that we cannot abandon natural gas, so we need to also be mindful about its climate performance. Then the second point indeed was that methane emissions are still increasing. So we need to do something about them, and that was exactly the point of tackling that via the EU methane regulation. But then the third point, and coming back to a bit what Thomas said, that the energy sector is the sector where the abatement of methane emissions is most cost efficient. And as we have just heard, it's really at a very little cost you can abate really a large part of the emissions. So we really need to take this chance and to go after this. Very reassured also to hear from the industry that there is still commitment to abating methane emissions, because I think this is a very, very important starting point, because when we see that we are all committed to the same goal, then I'm sure we will find practical ways for the implementation. Because this is what we see right now. It's, of course, whenever a new regulation comes in place, there's a lot of questions how to implement it in practice. And this is what we need to focus now on, the real practical and pragmatic implementation of the EU methane regulation. I was very honored to see it compared to GDPR, because I think that is really a piece of legislation that in the beginning was maybe a bit challenging for industry to do so, but then later on everybody saw the benefits and also the protection that it gives. And I think indeed with the methane regulation we can really get there to improve the performance of the gas sector. And indeed, maybe just to recall that for us really the starting point was to get the robust data, because it is true that on a large scale the data could be seen, but only, I mean, and also from satellites, we could get an increasing awareness of the methane problem out there, if we want to say it this way. At the same time, only when we go to the level of granularity to know exactly where the emissions are occurring, we can take also the abatement measures and track also the performance of the abatement measures themselves. So again, I would not say, or I hope that the methane regulation is not unworkable. We understand that it is challenging, so what we would like to do, because of course there is a lot of knowledge out there, there's a lot of knowledge in the sector, and there's a lot of knowledge in member states and among stakeholders, so we would like to really build on that knowledge and to put that knowledge together. For example, with member states we have started working in the context of the network of competent authorities, and of course we are very happy to engage with industry to see what solutions are being brought up. And maybe just one important element, that there is not one single solution to the challenges or to the questions of the EU methane regulation when it comes to demonstrate evidence. We see that there are several solutions being developed, and this is great because it doesn't have to be one solution. It can be as many good solutions as there are out there. So that's why we feel encouraged by all the work that is going into this reflection, and we are happy to work with all the stakeholders that are looking to work with us. So again, a pragmatic implementation, a practical implementation, and yes, we will of course review the progress, we will review what works, what doesn't work, but we can only do that when we started implementing and when we gain experience with the implementation.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for laying out the overall approach. Again, we can come back to some of those. Maybe just one immediate follow-up, which is, can you give us any sense of timing for filling in the gaps, so the delegated acts and things like the methane intensity, methodologies, limits, like when, I guess you're not supposed to tell us what they're going to be, but when we can expect those?
So the methane intensity is the last one to kick in. So as you know, it's around, starting from the very last obligation, the Commission is tasked to set a level of methane intensity, and that would kick in only as of 2030. So that is the very last, so to say, deadline set out in the regulation. And beforehand, of course, what needs to happen is we have a big report and study that will look at the European and the global gas markets. There is a lot of emphasis on security of energy supply. So before the Commission would set any levels, it has to know very well what is the situation. So for us, it's a process. So before coming to set any levels, we need to have this absolute clear picture about what is the situation in the market and also what is the performance of the companies. And maybe that's also, we time this review exactly like this in order to have this big work done, and also this work, of course, will be consulted, and we will be looking forward to receive everybody's input in order to be able to get this right. And of course, building backcasting from that, before that review, what we need is collection of data on intensities, so that we know what's the intensities out there currently at that time, at that moment in time. Before that, we need a methodology, and that is, I think, around 27 for the methane intensity methodology, because we need to collect the data that we need for this assessment based on a consistent methodology, so that we can be comparing apples with apples. And of course, all this, and here I'm coming back to my starting point, needs robust reporting, because only if everyone has a robust way of measuring its methane data, then they can report in a consistent way based on a common methodology. Then we can compare apples and apples. Then we can get a good picture of what's the methane intensities out there before setting any levels. And here, again, just to underline that security of supply is one of the key considerations.
Yeah. Okay.
So it's a full process, which I hope sounds very logical to everyone, because this is what we like to do.
So over the next 5 years, so the next milestone to look out for date-wise from the Commission, is that then in 2027 with the methodologies?
Yes, but beforehand, we of course work on the MRV equivalence, so all the data that will be coming in, and reporting has already started a few days ago, I think. Not sure all the reports are in yet, but we should get the data, I mean, I would say over the coming months and year, in order to start seeing a clear picture. And of course, just to say the final word, we are not starting from zero. I think the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership Voluntary Initiative has already been mentioned, so there is already a lot that is being done out there, and we are just building on that.
Let's turn to Japan, an idea of how you are approaching methane, and we've had an example of, I think, comprehensive overview of how the EU is approaching it. Is it the same for you?
Thank you, Sonia, and thank you very much for Eurogas for having me today. I think one of the role of me is to bring the Asian perspective to this conference. As you know, Japan and also our neighboring country, South Korea, has the huge dependency on the natural resources import to their economies. In case of Japan, we're depending on almost 95% of the natural gas for import in form of LNG. So we have been working, my organization, JOGMEC, we are the governmental organization to secure the natural gas and other oil, natural gas, and other mineral resources supplied to Japan. We have been very much closely working with producers and other economies to secure the supply to these materials to Japan. In field of natural gas or LNG, we have been organizing the Producers Consumers Conference since 2011, just after the Fukushima nuclear disaster. So we are committed, as a large importer, we are committed to work with our energy producers. So the purpose of that conference is fostering the dialogue between producers and consumers. And as Thomas mentioned, in his earlier part, the methane reduction is the area we can collaborate, producer and consumer can collaborate to reduce the footprint from the energy, and also to secure the supply of the natural gas, and also looking mid or longer term, like a 20, 30, 40, 50 dimension. We still need the energy to keeps lights on and keeps the economy moving. We clearly need some natural gas for the kind of the foundation of our society. So in this regard, Japan and South Korea have been working together to collect the voices from energy importer and energy consumers, sending the clear message that we are taking care of our emissions from the energy we import and we source. That is the kind of the starting point of our efforts. We, in 2023, in July, at the LNG Producer Consumer Conference, we have launched the initiative called the Coalition for LNG Emission Abatement Towards Net Zero. So collecting the voice from the energy consumers, then sending the clear message to the producers, then how it does work, how does it work? We are sending the questionnaire to the energy producers, asking their cutting-edge efforts and asking their status of the methane emission from their operation, then gather that result, and also as well as the best practices taken in the industry, and by disseminating these best practices to the industry to encourage for those of who have not taken the efforts to reduce the methane emission, because it's a quite low-hanging fruit and is the best way to tackle the emission from the operations. At the same time, that efforts could serve to create kind of the momentum or creating the kind of the common understanding among the energy buyers. Because to use energy or fossil fuels or LNG more specifically in the future, we have to understand what is the measures taken in that value chain. And also, we are heading towards that direction because that means that there are some kind of the differentiated market should be alive in the near future. So as a large buyer, we are sending the message that we have to understand that what is going on in that industry. That is our approach. So we are not taking the firm regulatory approach as European taking, but we are, as a large traditional buyers of the LNG, we are sending the message, and we are working together with the producer, and we are stepping forward towards the towards carbon neutrality by 2050. So that is our approach.
Okay. Yeah, we can come back maybe to compare a little bit more the approaches, but Jonathan, I wanted to come to you first. Thomas ended on a positive note, saying we have reasons to be hopeful, and there has been some progress. We've heard now two big importer regions lay out what they're doing, regulatory, and in this case more informative or reporting. Is there a cause? Do you see progress?
In a piece of disgraceful advertisement, I've just published a paper on a 3-year progress report for methane emissions, and I feel I need to slightly contradict the very upbeat message that's come from the platform so far, in that yes, there has been progress, but it's actually very difficult to know what it is, and it's very difficult to know what it is for several reasons. Firstly, an awful lot of documents have been signed by governments in the last few years. Mostly, though, what's been neglected is that if you look for signing by governments and companies from China, Russia, India, other important countries like Algeria, you mostly won't find those names in the documents. They're great documents, nothing to say bad about the documents. I think the other thing to say is that basically it's very difficult to argue with NGOs who come and see us and call us up and say, well, basically what's happening with methane emissions, we just see them going up. And I say, yeah, they are going up, but look, there's this and this. Yeah, but how do we know what's going on? And that engages something very important that's been mentioned on this platform, which is transparency. Now, one of the big problems with all of the documents that companies and governments have signed is they've got huge confidentiality notices within them. In other words, it's extremely difficult, whichever document, including the regulation, it's very difficult to get any data to be disclosed or even any methodologies that were used to get the data. Now, I'm sorry to say, having been around the gas business, and this is not an attack on gas, it's the same. Arguably, coal is worse and oil is similar. Basically, this industry is very good at talking to itself and not great at talking to the world. And the world is the people who actually need to be convinced of this. So we tend to retreat into technical stuff, which is very important. But essentially, what has to be explained is, if you want your data to be confidential, explain why. Why is it important for emissions to be confidential data? I've heard lots of suggestions or reasons for that. I don't think they are convincing. And I think that has to be really something that the industry has to focus on. We're running out of time, so I want to be very brief here. In some ways, it's unfortunate and maybe not fair that we've come to focus on gas. And if you look at the tracker, you'll see that actually oil and coal contribute more emissions than gas. And we've come to focus on LNG, which is a sort of small subset. But that's because we can kind of get our hands around LNG. You know, it comes from a certain place through a certain terminal. It's in nice little parcels in ships, and it's unloaded in a particular place. And we can kind of get that as a supply chain. So the LNG community, I think, now has a major responsibility to disclose how it's doing emissions. And a lot of companies have done that. But we are rather overly focused on North America and particularly the US. Now, that's okay, because the US is very important in LNG and particularly very important for Europe. And with the phase out of Russia and the tariff discussions with it's going to be more important. But the US isn't the only place we get LNG from. And we've got to try and engage Algeria, Nigeria, Qatar, which should have a great story to tell, but we hear nothing from the Qataris. We've got to engage all these other players as well, because the point that I think Christian made was we need a level playing field. At the moment, we've got people who aren't on the playing field yet, and we need to get that sorted out. And when we do that, we need to tell the world, not just each other, how we did it and what the problems of doing it are. And of course, we have to do that for the regulation, but not just for the regulation. Okay, I'm going to stop there.
Thank you very much. The regulation is not appropriate in itself.
Yes, exactly.
Maybe if we look at Japan and the EU, to what extent are you working together, and could we envisage importers coming together? And well, you said if we very simply put a $20 tax on methane, then the methane emissions, there we go. The IA looked at that, wouldn't change prices very much, but we still nonetheless have quite different approaches so far. So how close are those approaches? Are you, for example, in Japan, thinking about a regulatory step next? And where do you, to what extent do you, or are you able to work together?
Mm. Yeah, at this moment, from perspective of government of Japan, we are not taking the regulatory approach, but we are closely discussing with the European Commission and other nations like the United States, and how we can collect the data, and what could be the kind of the format, and what could be the requirement we need to understand the emission from the entire value chain. So our initiative, Clean Initiative, we have just launched this year's questionnaire to the LNG producers, more than 20, nearly 25 LNG producers. And before that, we have been discussing with the European Commission and also the other colleagues what could be the best suit questionnaire to the industry. And we are not setting the new kind of the standards or reporting format. We are not putting the huge burden to the industry. That is not our intent. So we have been discussing to align the questionnaire and the data requirement before we publish, before we send that questionnaire. Yeah.
And are you looking to bring on board some of these other producer countries that currently aren't on the map yet, as Jonathan said?
Yes, and pretty much we are closely working with them, yeah.
Sure.
I mean, for us, of course, we have taken the regulatory approach, so there's no going back, right? But yes, indeed, the Commission has bilateral and multilateral dialogues, and indeed multilateral dialogues also with other consumers, indeed, to see what the approaches are. And of course, we do hope that our partners follow us on that. But of course, we are also having dialogues with the producers, mostly in a bilateral format, but also in a multilateral format. So these are very, very important dialogues in order to ensure that everybody can cope with the requirements of the methane regulation, because especially when it comes to producers, they have very different systems. And this is one of the reasons why the methane regulation is very flexible about how to comply with the regulation. So what is the evidence that can be provided in order to ensure compliance is not set out in the regulation exactly so that it allows various solutions to come up and that those solutions can be targeted to the realities of the third country from which in which the natural gas and oil are produced. So I think this is very, very important, because sometimes we understand that there is a need for guidance, but that guidance cannot be a one-size-fits-for-all. This is what I understand, because there are different jurisdictions, they have different rules, their markets are differently organized, so there is no one-size-fits-all guidance that the Commission can in a way release, and then it would solve our problems. However, what we can do is to engage really with all our international partners to see how they are organized and to work on mutually convenient solutions in order to make sure that that evidence can be provided. And again, as the regulation is flexible on that, we are very confident and hopeful that those solutions will be found for our international partners.
If I can just add, I find it's good to have in mind that when we're talking about LNG exporter or natural gas exporters in general, the US is very different from other suppliers, right? In most places, you have a facility and that feeds gas into the LNG, and then you do one measurement study, your data improves by 1 million. And at the same time, most places outside the United States don't really have that many measurement studies. Now, the United States has the benefit of having many measurement studies and monitoring technologies in place, but it's got a very intricate industry. The natural gas production is commingled. So I think the challenges are very different, right? One may be a bit more about kind of the methodology of how you mix different types of gas and parts of the supply chain, and the other might be just about getting out and doing some measurement.
There's a kind of interesting parallel for me in this regulation, and as I look out in the audience, I see several people who went through, as I did, the liberalisation packages for the gas industry. And what happened with those packages was that when we started, everyone said, "Oh, this is impossible. You know, it's a disaster for security, and it'll mean we won't be able to do this, that, and the next thing." And then, as we went through the packages, we started to say, "Well, why are the Russians and the Algerians and other people not engaging with this? Because this is going to be big stuff for them." I was part of a bunch of meetings in the years when the UK was part of the EU. I was part of those meetings. And what then happened was that as we got nearer and nearer and nearer the deadline for liberalisation, suddenly these countries started screaming, "Oh, you know, no one told us about this. We didn't know this was happening." I have a feeling that we could see a little bit of a similar situation here. It would be good to get these countries involved at this early stage. Whether we can get their attention for this, I'm not certain. But I think it's going to be interesting with Yarita-san's, the Clean Initiative is very interesting in terms of the questionnaire they send out and you know, the information that we get. I mean, it's clear that, I think Yarita-san, it's clear that some of your questionnaires don't get answered, some do get answered. And so, you know, you've got an interesting, you actually force them to say something or to refuse to say something. I think that's a very interesting way of approaching the situation, because then we've got a much better idea of, you know, if they're not answering, why not? Is it because they don't know? Is it because they feel threatened by it? This is a really sort of important question of actually dialoguing with countries, as you say, the US, highly sophisticated, lots of data, lots of technical capability. Others, less so.
Yeah. Maybe if I may quickly react on that. I mean, those who have been following the methane regulation from its proposal to its end know that this is how we started. But then, of course, there was a lot of discussions, and the co-legislators wanted to make it stronger. And this is why we have now, and I must say, especially on the MRV, it is such a, so monitoring, reporting, verification, sorry for the abbreviation, it's such a crucial fundament for whatever action one might want to take. So methane fee, you just mentioned methane fee. You can only impose a fee if you're absolutely sure about what you measure. So in a way, monitoring, reporting, and verification is really a starting point for whatever action one might want to take now. If we had it left or if it stayed like the Commission proposal, we might have gotten information, we might not have gotten information. Of course, we kept saying that, of course, not having information is information in itself, because then why is there no information? Is there something to hide? Is there something that doesn't work? Nevertheless, this is not where we are today. Today we have a regulation, and that regulation is the one that we need to implement, and that we are looking forward to really work, all our partners. And I might say, I think from what we say, this time, especially for the EU partners, they are engaging with us, so it's not a last-minute waking up. And maybe it's also thanks to events like this and Eurogas events today, raising the importance of the matter, because it's true that methane at some point in the beginning, it used to be a small stakeholder community. I think there were the few of us coming together and discussing, and now it has been really elevated to the awareness of everyone. And I guess also thanks to that, today we are there, we are talking with our partners, and we are constructively finding solutions with them.
Okay. And partners in this case are, I guess, partners in the industry, but also potential trade partners, other importer countries, exporter countries.
I said our bilateral dialogues.
Yeah. Are there questions? We've got about 10 minutes. Yeah. See, 1, 2, 3. Why don't we take 3 questions, and then we'll come to the panel with those. Yeah, we can start
Thank
here.
you, Andre Belli. I'm an independent consultant. I have basically a comment, and I'd like to hear your opinions. With methane emission regulation, we have 2 issues, actually, one geopolitical and one technical. The technical one, and here I kind of like resonate what Jonathan said, it's very difficult to monitor, and methane emissions are not like carbon emissions. They are not stable. They are varying. They are sporadic. And one of the issues with transparency, from what I have observed with some of the projects that I conducted, one of the issues for oil producers, especially from non-democratic countries, regarding transparency is very simple: that to cover your gas flaring, you are doing venting. And the only thing to cover it up, you have to be non-transparent. That's as simple as that. And then we are coming to the geopolitical one. The only country one of the only countries, the biggest gas producer who is willing to cooperate, has a presidential administration that very clearly advised, kind of, to its gas producers not to cooperate with the European Union on gas methane emissions regulation. Yeah? And so what do you do in these 2 contexts? It's very interesting to understand. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I think my question goes a little bit along the lines of what has already been said and what was said in the introductory comments, and that relates to the technological potential for sensors and satellites. Is there a way to reduce the burden on producers, not just oil and gas, but other producers of methane, by using sensors, and or if you can't get results from the individual companies, and or do you check the information that's provided by those who answer the questionnaires vis-a-vis what is provided through existing technology? And I suppose over the course of the next 10 years, 5 years, I guess, till 2030, those technologies will improve and become even more granular.
Thank you. And we'll take a 3rd question here at the front.
Hello, I am Kutalmus from Zero Emission Traders Alliance. Thank you for this informative session. The methane emission regulation is generally discussed around the LNG trade and the producers, but also there is a reality of the pipeline gas. For example, particular countries like Turkey, they are directly exporting to the EU, and they are not the dominant producers. So what should be the approach for these type of countries?
Okay, thank you. Someone pick up on the last question first.
Okay.
Jonathan?
Okay, so I think the regulation, actually it's not the regulation, it's the answers that the EU gave to the 2 workshops that were held. And the answer is you need to get documentation from your supplier or the shipper before you agree to receive the gas. In other words, it's going to be whoever you are, it's going to be your responsibility to request the documentation. Now, if the documentation is not available, or they refuse to give it to you, answer to Andre's question of the non-cooperators, then you need to question whether you actually are able to take the gas, or if you're going to take it, whether you can pass it on to an EU importer.
Maybe just
right?
exactly, except a slight nuance to the end. So non-compliance with the regulation never entails a ban.
Right.
So there is no ban in the regulation. The gas can be placed on the EU market. What non-compliant gas is facing is penalties. So this is another discussion that we're having with the member states, because the penalty regime is established by member states. So it's not the European Commission establishing it. It's each member state establishing it for themselves. So we are trying to work with member states who have also a lot of questions on penalties. But it never entails a ban on the gas. So a ban to place the gas on the market. Now, of course, as Jonathan says, there might be buyers who say, you cannot give me this information, I will look for another supplier. But this is, in a way, the natural way of working in a market, whether it's binding or voluntary. We expect that those importers that are more mindful about their climate performance and the climate performance of the gas that they are importing will be also more mindful of getting this information or not getting this information. And maybe, I mean, I would like the tech question to Thomas, because I'm sure that he's much better placed to answer that. But just a quick word that we, in the methane regulation, have verification. So the data that will be reported needs to be verified by an independent verifier, so to make sure that the data is reliable.
Do you want to pick on the tech question?
Sure,
Questions?
yeah, absolutely. And I think this has to do also with, can we make it less burdensome for some of the producers? And I think we have to have in mind that we will need a suite of technologies. Satellites, in some places, might provide a kind of basin average, but for most places, you will need a combination of on-the-ground measurements, either by drones or planes or installed facilities, monitoring towers or OGI cameras, and satellites to capture all the spectrum of emissions. I think there's certainly a road to go, and you can start with the data that you have, and that might include just the satellite data with the basin average. But the goal should be to improve to the level where you have a bit more confidence that your emissions intensity is representative of what's going on in the production facility and the supply chain.
Yeah, just I want to echo Thomas' point. And from technical measurement, it'll be necessary to be balanced between the technology, applying the full available technology, and also the economics, because it's not realistic to put all the sensors and the cameras on every equipment in the whole entire value chain. So in some part we can use the satellite or fixed airborne or drone to get the broad sense of the emissions. Then we can apply more detailed sensors or monitoring equipment to the specific areas. So we are developing these measurement technology or protocols in combination of these two ends, top down and bottom up.
Do you check the answers in the questionnaires that you receive in any way? Do you?
Yes, we got some best practices, I would say, from the last year's questionnaire, and we published that compiled result in the annual report. And we are aiming to publish this year's annual report in this autumn. So yeah, we are hardly working with the energy producers right now.
Okay, I think verification is something that we're working on with some partners at the University of Texas, and it's a very complicated subject. I just wanted to say one thing about satellites. I dare to say this with Antoine half sitting here. I mean, one of the slightly depressing things, if you read the IMEO, International Methane Emissions Organization report, is that for over a year they discovered 1,500 really large-scale emissions and where they came from. They notified the governments and the companies. They got, I think from memory, 15 responses of which 12 were actually acted upon. Now, what that tells you is just because you try and embarrass people by telling them they're doing a terrible job, it sadly doesn't necessarily mean they're going to change their behavior. So that's something that we have to take into account as well.
And the geopolitical question, so we have an administration actively, well, rolling back methane.
You know, I mean, it'd be interesting to hear, we probably haven't got time for companies in the audience, but everything I hear from certainly large US companies and international companies suggests they will not change their behavior. They're on the path. Smaller companies might be a different story.
And maybe just last word on, I mean, as my Director General already referred to, the repower plan. Of course, the EU has taken the decision or the Commission proposes to phase out Russian gas imports by 2027. So, of course, if there is no cooperation there, well, there is a phase-out plan.
Can I just quickly?
Very quickly.
We should have in mind that there's a lot of new LNG coming into the market too. So this might be helpful in a sense.
Yeah. Let me just see, I know there are some other questions. I've seen one at the back, and there was one there. We're at 3:30. There's a third one there. I would propose that perhaps we close it and you approach the panel directly, because we only have a 20-minute coffee break. And if we take those, I think we're not going to have any coffee break. So can we have a quick round of applause for the panel? And feel free to approach our speakers, and we'll reconvene in 20 minutes, so at 10:02. Hello and welcome back. Welcome back, everyone. So we've got another 2 panels now, split up or interspersed by a keynote. So that will hopefully all keep us on our toes. Once again, we will take at least a round of questions at the end of each panel. So please do prepare some questions if you have them. I'll call up the next panel right away. So Kjetil Bjørnar, Dan Simmons, Claudio Ciccini, and Vikram Mansukani. If you'd all like to come up and take a seat here.
Oh yeah, we shift like this. Oh, okay, sorry.
Okay, so we're moving on a little bit now, and I guess I'd say we're probably getting more granular in the discussion. So this panel is going to be focused on the business case, demand for differentiated natural gas. And let's see, if we start at the very end, we have Claudio. How do I pronounce your surname properly?
Sorry?
How do I pronounce your last name?
Zucchini.
Zucchini.
You do it quite well.
Zucchini, okay. Zucchini, Business Director for Energy and Climate for Europe, Middle East, Africa, and India at Dow Europe. So he's basically responsible for climate and energy strategy across the Dow manufacturing sites in that whole region. So he leads on risk management for energy and carbon cost exposure. Has been with the company for a long time and previously worked on Germany specifically, so I guess a lot of exposure to gas and security of supply and cost and so forth in that capacity. Then we have Vikram next to him, Vikram Mansukani, Executive Vice President for LNG trading at Osaka Gas here in Europe, so he's in charge of LNG for them here. More than 20 years experience in the oil and gas business, especially on the sales and trading side, and also mergers and acquisitions. And prior to that, has a long experience in investment banking. And Osaka Gas, big Japanese gas company, so bringing in, again, something of an international dimension. And then we have Kjetil Bjørnar, Manager Energy Origination at Equinor, and Dan Simmons next to me, Head of Gas Origination at Engie. And they're going to tell you in a nutshell what they do, because neither of them sent in a bio. There you go.
Welcome. Well, my name is Kjetil Bjørnar, as mentioned. I educated in law from the University of Oslo. Worked for the Ministry of Government Administration for 3 years. Then I joined Statoil back in the days. working for a corporate function in industrial relations, and then I joined the commercial side of Equinor in the gas business in 2000. So I have 25 years of experience from the business. Energy origination, as you mentioned.
Perfect, thank you.
And myself, Dan Simmons. So I'm a chemist way back when, by training. I then entered the banking world. Then I dabbled with energy, joined a company called Enron, which left me rather than the other way around. Then joined EDF Trading. I had a spate at the International Energy Agency, where I've met a few of you in the audience before, which was an interesting experience. Back to EDF Trading, and then the last 10, 11 years, I've been working as a gas originator in ENGIE. The latter 4 or 5 years are very focused on the transition and low carbon gases.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So, the business case for differentiated gas, and I'd perhaps propose we start with the producers, the investors in production of that gas, and then move to the ones who are, in theory, interested in buying it, trading in it. So, if we look at Equinor and ENGIE, is there a business case for differentiated gas? And if so, what is driving that for you today?
Should I go first?
I think so.
Okay, I think so. Quick backdrop, Norwegian history from Norwegian continental shelf. Statoil and Equinor was born back in the 70s under a quite sophisticated regulated regime that led to strict regulations when it comes to emissions, venting, flaring, and also the nature of our resources has been paramount to where we are today. Equinor produces quite some amount of gas, all headed for Europe, and by that we produce a lot of data. That data, as mentioned, is presented in our annual sustainability report. Since 2001, everything is public on the website. It's also reported. It goes to the ministry. It is verified after the methodology we apply, and it's all public on public governmental websites from each field specifically. By nature, this has led to good quality data. We're sitting on it. We have, I think we have the trust and the transparency when you go about the numbers. You can easily look up the CO2 content, the CO2 emissions or the methane emissions from each and every field on the Norwegian continental shelf. Today we see a growing demand in the market for carbon solutions. Equinor is offering this to its clients, industrials or others. It goes about everything from ETS to carbon credits and to environmental attribute certificates like GEOs and everything. We also think that this data that we sit on from our production should be brought to the clients if they have a need for it. And I think, is there a market for it? Indeed it is. I think the market needs to define and shape the future of how we go about methane regulation. I think we need to apply transparency and openness and trust in our numbers. But the key thing is we need a systematic approach to this to avoid double counting, so we can create the trust in the market that the license that has produced gas can bring the data over a platform, and that creates the data set that the customers can translate into value for him, whether that is responsibility, whether that is pure cash, or a decarbonized product. We also see the use of this for our own projects, like hydrogen, blue hydrogen products with a new taxonomy coming. You can think of that for blue ammonia. You can also look into decarbonized power. So that's where I end, and leave it to someone else.
Yeah, so maybe I take up the mantle from a midstream perspective, because as you probably know, ENGIE is no longer a producer of nat gas. About 10 years ago, something like that, 7, 8 years ago, we sold that activity off to a company called Neptune. So we now are more in the breaking bulk business, servicing our clients, a very client-centric organization. And what we see is the, let's say, initial sprouting of a demand for differentiated gas. We've heard a lot today about the theoretical possibility and whether it should or shouldn't happen. But I can tell you that we have customers on the books, have had customers on the books for several years, who are purchasing differentiated gas at a premium, and that may not be the sort of premium that sets alight, upstream balance sheets from one day to the next, but it is a premium and it is a differentiated product. Some customers are interested in, let's say, where the gas is coming from. Some customers are interested in the technology by which it's been produced. For example, there was a phase when shale gas was very much to be avoided. So the idea of buying differentiated gas certificates which were not shale attracted a premium in Europe. Well, there's different evolutions, and I think that shows you that what you need is, as Kjetil was saying, an organized data set, and indeed good data, good quality data that people can trust. I think one of the big challenges in our industry is this perception of greenwashing, the perception that as an industry we're there to cover our tracks and lie to customers, or I don't even know what, but there have been some fairly massive examples of some slightly crazy trades put together that probably didn't do the industry very much good in the past, where carbon credits were deemed to offset entire boatloads of oil, for example, which maybe didn't capture the popular imagination. But I think if we can come out with a message as an industry which is very positive around and very transparent around how we are trying to create this virtuous circle, then I think indeed we can have customer buy-in. Is that all customers straight from the get-go? No, it won't be. Some customers are more sensitive, some are more looking at their image at the moment, and some are maybe more looking at survival from day to day at the moment. So, that doesn't mean that we have to push this into one particular segment necessarily and mandate it from the start. But I can tell you that ENGIE, we have an all-scope emission target. What that means is we don't just look at our scope 1, we look at our scope 3, obviously our scope 2. And what we find, I think, when we look at that is, this is what I was saying in an internal pitch last week actually, is that when you look at scope 1, there are things you can do. They are very capex intensive, usually, or they're quite expensive. When you look at scope 3, there are things you can do right now, which, for example, might be this traceability idea with CO2 emissions, methane emissions, even origin sourcing. And I think that's interesting in light of what the Commission came out with last week, looking at banning Russian gas. Well, how do you know? How do you know? You see it comes up in all the statistics for different countries. I think the Netherlands was 10% Russian gas last year. Okay, how do you buy not Russian gas? This has all been solved. This commingling question has all been solved. We have it with PPAs in different industry, of course, but this has already been tackled and solved. So the question is, how do we get on and roll this thing out? And I think the gas industry in general will be better for it.
Okay, thank you. Claudio, let's go to you. I noticed when you were saying it's not going to be all customers from the get-go, you were shaking your head. Are you interested in differentiated gas?
Yeah, first of all, let me thank you that you invited as well the chemical industry, which I'm more or less representing as Dow Chemical. I guess we have a significant footprint in Europe, serving automobile industry, construction, infrastructure, packaging. So we are more or less in the beginning of the value chain, saying that you as well know that being chemical operator, being energy intensive is at the moment, let me say, a hard situation while we are competing against a lot of, let me say, issues that we are facing as industry. So we are talking about availability of gas, which is driving prices, right? So we move from one day to another from relatively solid supplier, our pipeline supply, if I call it, to an LNG market, which is developing rapidly. At the same time, I guess we're trying to attract LNG to Europe because everybody knows capacity needs to be built up to additionally serve Europe versus, let me say, other regions in the world that is going well. I'm not sure whether this kind of regulation is creating some upsets or issues on that because, again, what we at least not need and where we are not able to continue is having more increasing prices, which continues to at least let the European industry, chemical industry, maybe others working better, but at least for us, it's a challenging game. And competitive is one of the biggest challenge. That's the reason why I'm decided to get here in order to address that, especially in Brussels. Saying that, I guess assuming that we need to live with the fact that gas in Europe will still factor 3, 4 more expensive. I guess we need to find ways to follow a decarbonization road in Europe, which is not additionally first killing all the industry before we get off-takers. I guess it's important that we find ways to incentivize these kind of diversified gases. And keep in mind, this methane regulation has as well indirect impact on other regulation, like low carbon hydrogen, I guess, which you can assume as industry, chemical industry, do not see green hydrogen as a short-term solution, as this, again, we talk about competitiveness, is still far away from being competitive against other gases. And I guess methane regulation is something which is indirectly moving into that. And this all uncertainty, I guess, that is something we need to solve. And then that's why I hope what I heard before, the transparency, the ruling, and whatever is now under discussion is getting to a point that this is workable for off-takers like Dow or like other chemical industries. And if we get to that point, I guess we can talk about if there is value in the moment in diversified gases. I would say as chemical industry not. And have different reasons. You can start with demand, right? So the demand is not picking up. Our customers are not picking up the additional costs. So it is hard to path it through. And I guess that's the same issue for you or for my partners here on the panel. Producing these value might be possible, but if you do not have somebody who is able to pay for that, it's not rolling out. And I guess that's the biggest issue in the moment.
Okay, thank you. Vikram, what about you? What, I guess, is Osaka's interest in potentially, or how is the EU methane regulation potentially relevant to you in terms of opportunities it poses or also risks?
Thank you. Yeah. So thank you for having me, actually, first of all. And actually, for us, in terms of our distinguishing factor, what we've done is we've taken the initiative and proactive step of going down the route of e-methane. So we are obviously interested in alternate gas sources. And the way we've gone about this investment is for the simple reason is that obviously, as a country, Japan is going to be net zero compliant by 2050, at least we hope to do so. And Osaka Gas has taken the step of trying to take that one step further and making sure that by 2030, 1% of our input into our system will be from e-methane. We have taken a step because of several reasons, social reasons, and of course it's complementary to our infrastructure. We manage power stations in Japan. We have 7 million customers that we service, the majority of them being gas, about 5 million, the balance being power. And we've done these investments globally, whether it be in the US, for example, in Tallgrass that we just announced recently, to develop this technology, to then be able to export this to Japan to feed into our systems, for us to then be able to function in our ecosystem. And e-methane is probably the best route that we've taken for us in terms of achieving that. We have 2 power stations that can accommodate that infrastructure, and obviously within that also complements our LNG trading business, which we've been growing globally as well, whether that be in Singapore or in Europe. For us, just not without sounding redundant, the main points have been articulated in terms of feasibility, transparency, and being able to get this to work economically. These are critical factors that we need to also monitor and ensure. If we do have that ecosystem in place, especially the transparency, and there isn't the double counting that was mentioned earlier, we would be participating in that as well. From the buyer's perspective, without sounding too general, we are open to these ideas of alternate gas sources or gas types, because not only the countries make the commitment, but we do see that as a moral imperative for our customers that have asked for it, and that's extremely important to us as well. I do see LNG activity increasing, as was mentioned earlier by the DG of the European Commission into Europe significantly. Having said that, we do have to find the right pathway in terms of methane regulations, to your earlier question, and how we work through that. For us on that specific topic, what's critical is the timeline and how these measurements are going to come into effect. It's really hard to impose on US suppliers, for example, if we're talking about US LNG coming in, of the type of regulations that they need to meet, and who does that onus fall on? I mean, for now, we're talking about the buyer's perspective. But we have to take into account things such as costs, and obviously, who's going to be indemnified from that, and how will the trading system actually evolve from that? Will it function as per norm, or are we putting some more hurdles in place? We're very pro for these systems and these enforcements to come into effect, but they have to be clear and articulated well beforehand, so that the trading system and these ecosystems can function properly, and that's really important for us.
Okay. Maybe a question to you, but also maybe to the rest of the panel. What's the main, what's the main cost, where does the main cost of something like the EU methane regulation come from? Is that in the need to mitigate those methane emissions? Is it in the reporting requirements? And who bears that additional cost?
Just very quickly, I think that's a really important question of where that's passed through in terms of the value chain. In essence, if we can have some agreement and understanding on standardizing that, that would in fact allow a lot of people to prepare for it. There's a lot of arguments for producers having to pick up that cost, or consumers having to pick up that cost, or is it a sharing of the two? And what sort of mechanisms of where that cost is going to be applied? Is it in terms of, as you said, reporting, or is it in the consumption of it, on the production of it? I think we have to work very closely, and given the timelines, a lot more expediently towards these measures and getting that clarity. That's at least from our perspective.
Does anyone else have a?
Yeah, and I guess from a producer's perspective, Equinor sits on a portfolio of very low methane emissions. So I'm not sure how much we do in that respect, but we see electrification on the continental shelf, electrifying Troll, Martin Linge, we're looking at electrifying our LNG facility at Melkøya. That comes with a cost, and I think the market could help to bring some value back to the investment you do to come down, and that's hence differentiated gas might come with a differentiated price as well. That's probably the ask and question to be answered, if this is going to, if producers will entertain more investments to reduce their emissions.
Yeah, maybe I can reinforce maybe, but say the same sort of thing really. I think if we can get to this virtuous circle where there is some sort of premium, some sort of recognition in one way or another, and it may just be advertising, or it may be non-tangible in that way to start with. But I think that's what a lot of customers want to see. They want to be able to choose, and it's kind of bizarre when you think about the choices that you make. Your choice of where you get your food from, for example, and it's labelled. You have some knowledge, right? And it's a bit weird, I think, in the energy industry that we're such a huge consumer and that we have such little information about what we're buying. So I think it's a moral imperative is indeed part of the question. Why can't we provide this extra information? And maybe initially there's not a gulf in prices. Maybe things need to settle down, but the information is all there, and there's enough EU regulations already within each company to generate vast amounts of information about every trade we do. We have KYC obligations, we have reporting obligations, we have all sorts of, know your customer, anti-money laundering. Everyone that's operating in this room knows about all these things. Why do we not know where it comes from? Why do we not know the carbon emissions as well? And why can't we maybe package that into something that's not just a cost, but that has some sort of value associated with it? License to operate is maybe the easiest, but there's a role, I think, for the Commission maybe in setting down some standards or some public procurement type standards, something like this, which could help bootstrap the industry along. So it doesn't need to start necessarily with the chemicals industry, it doesn't need to start with the residential customer. But you do wonder a little bit, if residential customers were given the choice, what they would choose if they were given the choice.
Probably depends on price. But just picking up on the point around data, because in the previous panel, we heard at least some voices saying we don't actually know as much as we think we know, or as we'd like to know about methane emissions. So is there, I guess, for different individuals here, do we have enough data and information to credibly be able to sell a certain kind of gas with certain characteristics? In this case, we can take methane. I appreciate it can also be origin and so on, but in this case, take methane emissions as an example to an end customer, for that end customer to be to be prepared to pay a premium because there is sufficient trust that yes, this product is what it says it is. Do you think we are there? We have enough?
I think we have enough information in certain circumstances, and the whole EU industry does not have that information for every molecule that's delivered. But for the size of the customer base that could be triggered from one day to the next by some targeted regulation, let's say. Shetel's already said, the whole of the NCS, that's whatever, 150 BCM a year of gas. It's quite a lot. We'd be doing well to find customers for all that before we even start on the UK, which probably has similar regulation, the Dutch offshore as well. So, no, we can't do it for the entire production base of the EU. And quite apart from anything else, I think you have to start small. So we probably have too much of it to start with, good quality gas, for the customers that are out there. And why not, therefore, push it down the chain and let people choose? Maybe it's not something people are interested in, but and as you say, it will depend on the price. But initially, let's see what that price is and whether people will buy it, because price has a habit of reflecting supply and demand, indeed.
Yeah. Anyone else have a view on that?
No, I just wanted to add, I guess, even for off-takers like us, right, chemical industry, I guess we are not consuming gas mainly to produce steam, but as well it's a feedstock, right, for a certain process, it's a feedstock. And even for that, I guess, all the discussion about corporate targets are going now as well on this additional question, Scope 3, which is mainly gas and in normal circumstances is well important. I guess everybody's aware we're switching from pipeline gas to LNG. I guess the footprint has increased, and at a certain point you need to find solution on that. So I definitely agree that there might be a market coming or interest in that area in order, if you have customers, you can build up the value chain on that, but just the principle to implementing a regulation, which is definitely driving prices in Europe, because the new market is relying in Europe on LNG prices, because that is attracting coming gas to Europe or not. I guess I'm not sure whether this is the right way in the moment to do that way and in that kind of regulation. And I heard before in the other panel from the Japanese approach. I guess Japan lived maybe the whole time on the fact that they need to import energies, right? And 95% import, they will not hurt their own industry in the way that they say, take it or leave it. And I guess that's something where we need to find a smooth way in order to get that implemented, and understanding as well that from producer perspective, you see a value in that. On the other hand, I can as well question why it's not self-paying back, right? If you save gas or avoid methane leakage, why it's not self-paying back? Why it's always linked to an increase, which is somebody paying, and definitely, it's the basic chemical which start to pay for that, or it's the power sector or a self-consumer. It's always the question of paying. How much cost is that in your process? And that's I really would like to question whether that's the right approach in the moment where we are currently economic-wise.
So you, I guess, question. As we heard from the Commission, we've gone down this regulatory road, so it's to some extent that's where we are. But you'd question whether that is the right approach, and your worry is that it will ultimately limit the gas that European companies have access to, and therefore push up prices or keep up high prices.
Let me say it that way. I guess in general, hearing as well today is a lot of uncertainty about the regulation, how to measure, what is the impact, how is that working with the suppliers, is that their way out, right? So that's the first one. And definitely, I guess, I would assume that it will be helpful to get clarity, right? to define the rules and not keeping that open until end of 27, end of 28, I don't know. Because at the end, again, a lot of FIDs are linked to these decisions, right? And I agree that US built up LNG. US is not the only region in the world, but I guess that is a region with the most growth expectation, which should deliver the world with LNG. And I'm not sure whether it's true or not, but it could be that there is a delay in FIDs because off-takers like you are not able to find customers who are willing to buy with that uncertainty, right? So I guess we need to be very careful in the current setup as we see a lot of announcement of closures in Europe, that is not ending up in a domino where we are a long time in a recession and we are not progressing on that. So that's just my concern a little bit.
Sorry, can I just add to that? I think just to Claudio's comments, this is this could end up becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy that if we do go down this route and we're the only continent to do that, for example, for lack of a better expression, what's going to happen is the LNG flows are going to shift in terms of direction. It's going to become much more expensive to bring gas into Europe. We're going to end up shooting ourselves in the foot because we're paying a premium. Most of the cargo is going to be destined for Asia, which is where a lot of people are thinking about. We're hearing a lot of noise on this in public from the suppliers themselves, whether it's from the Middle East or from other parts, of redirecting their customers to Asia. Fundamentally, that's demand-driven. That makes a bit more sense relative to Europe. But if we start to put in extra measures such as these, and we're already down there, but where they're not clear, the point is, if they're not clear, it's going to create greater clouds, greater uncertainty, and you're not going to have a commitment to long-term contracts or long-term security, which is what people want at the end of the day. All of us want that in whatever value chain mix that you're in. You're going to have a massive spread in prices between the different continents. For some, that provides a trading opportunity. For some, it's a huge loss. For us in Europe, it's a huge loss. We're going to end up paying more. So we don't want to go down that route necessarily. At least we don't. We hope not to. So I think we have to get to this point of clarity and transparency as soon as possible so that there is a smoothing effect in terms of trade flows and that we can have a balanced mechanism of where the LNG flows to. And we don't have a situation like we did in 2022 where we see massively escalated prices, not because of this, but for other reasons, for a black swan event. So this shouldn't become a black swan event if that's the actual thing that people are expecting it not to happen, or hope it doesn't.
So it sounds like you're saying the greatest risk to such a great spread in the market of prices, it's the uncertainty rather than necessarily the regulation itself. It's the fact that we have a period now of a couple of years potentially where not everything is clear.
Yeah, I mean, perception creates much greater volatility than reality, and everyone knows that. And as a result, you have this exponential effect of people wanting to supply the gas going to different markets. And then you have this crowding effect of, right, we want to drop all of the gas into Asia, whether it's coming from the US or from the Middle East. Then you have a feeling of a great glut. And then you have a lot of these projects possibly not going to FID, so it has a knock-on effect going backwards. What doesn't change is the pricing mechanism for the market that's going through these changes will remain elevated, and that's the area of issue.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I have a quick comment to Claudio. We always talk about this as a cost, an added cost to the industry, or the added cost. I think from a commercial perspective, you should see this as a value. If you can translate this into value to your product, it could be, let's say, something that distinguishes your product from others. We're not here to just increase the cost, we're here to bring in the value of being a low-carbon environment, low-carbon products, and trust in the market. So we need to look at it slightly differently as well. I know that it always sounds like it comes with a cost, but we also say that, well, we might charge something for our investments to reduce our footprints.
I do agree. I guess that is as well an angle where you can drive these move into that direction, right? Create a demand at a customer levels, right? Let me say the chemical, or the chemical industry should pay for all these transitional or regulatory. I guess we need to find a way in Europe to create or stimulate a market which is paying off at least of that transitional. That's what we see everywhere, right? It's not gas. I mean, we see electricity, we see it grid costs, we see it wherever. I guess it's in my view, a question of time, and definitely as well economic power, which is typically driving, demand. And unfortunately, in the moment we are far away, and since years. And I guess that's a little bit, creating the urgency and not to over-regulate everything and try to drive it. I guess we are at the moment not in a position to let at least not Dow Chemical, or definitely as well other chemical companies like Dow.
Are there any questions? I've got a couple more, but we can see if there are any. We've got 10, 15 minutes left. I see one there. A second one there. Let's take those two. I think those are the only two I see for the moment.
This is TJ Conway from RMI. This question, I guess, is probably for Claudio, but I would love other people's perspectives too. We've done a lot of life cycle analysis and find that actually the methane intensity of your feedstock can have a significant impact on the product carbon footprint of any particular chemical product. And so, you know, and I mean, it's if you would assume, for example, in the United States, 3% methane intensity going down to 0.2% leakage, it's 20 to 25% product carbon footprint reduction. And I think in some of our conversations with the chemical companies, this isn't properly accounted for, not because of the chemical companies' accounting, but because of carbon accounting guidance overall. So I was wondering if you might be able to comment on that and how we might be able to reflect that in as a positive if you can actually access low methane gas and demonstrate the value that it brings.
You want to answer right away? Go ahead.
No, I can wait as well.
I'm just going to see, do you have a microphone over there for the question? And then there was a third question, Kathleen, just on the end there. We'll take the three and then we'll come back to the panel.
Thank you very much. Really interesting discussion. And I really love the comments you made, Daniel, about how we have labels on our food. And so it just makes sense that we should know where our gas is coming from. We, Clean Air Task Force, I didn't introduce myself, are actually rolling out some ads saying that exact same thing to try and think about how to translate this potential commercial value into actual value. I would also just really quickly point to a report we did with Rystad, actually modeling the potential for trade diversion of LNG and also trying to understand some of the actual costs for abatement. Following through in the methane regulation, it was about 7 cents per MMBTU, and I think it's a really interesting study that we did to try and understand what the risks are, because I think it's really important to have some empirical data behind that. My question is actually, we spent a lot of time talking about consumers. I'm curious to get your thoughts on where the financial sector, finance institutions, might come in helping build this demand in terms of actually providing lower cost capital for top performers, either through raising money on capital markets or through sovereign lending tied to different ESG scores. But I'm just curious, is there a role for the finance sector maybe to step in before consumers and say, we're actually willing to give these top performers a break on an interest rate or a cheaper loan because you're following through on these methane commitments? Could that maybe help spur the demand for differentiated natural gas?
Okay, thank you. And then, yeah, David.
David Abiago, journalist from Argus Media. So we have Jutta Paulus later, the MEP who wrote well for the Parliament, did that. I was just wondering, in terms of political uncertainty or changes, what do you expect? Do you think the EU can review it in your sense as an industry to simplify it? We see other simplification legislation coming up. So do you think that's a possibility, or do you feel it will stay as it is? Thanks.
Okay, thank you. So 3 questions. What do you expect politically? Do you expect also with the simplification packages a substantial change in methane regulation at EU level? And then potential role for the finance sector and going to the capital markets. It's maybe more on the producer side. And finally, I think one for you, Claudio, the impact of methane intensity or methane emissions intensity on the final product can be quite substantial. How can you bring that or do something with that to create value add? Go ahead.
Should I start?
Yes. Okay.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for the question. I guess I totally agree that as chemical company with having different products with different footprints, with different intensity is definitely something where we definitely know what scope emission, whether it's come from 1, 2, or 3, is ending up in the product, and what is the easiest way or the economic best way to change that product, to diversify, and being able, partially we are as well able to find customers who are willing to pay for that. The bigger issue is that we are fighting on a lot of fronts, right? So we try to tackle the scope 1 in Europe, right? So we are paying a lot of carbon taxes, or not taxes is the wrong word, but cost for carbons, which is known since years, and I guess transition is going on. On the other hand, you have the scope 2, which is mainly power sector, where we are as well following, let me say, a transition, moving to renewable energies, moving to different elements. But certain processes are, you cannot switch them quite quickly. I mean, cracking naphtha or whatever is creating a lot of, let me say, fuels, and it's energy intensive. So there's a, let me say, huge step to be done in order to make that. So looking on all these buckets, I guess the first major question, how can we solve the biggest emissions, which are direct or, let me say, energies that we are purchasing or in order to run. And then definitely the third element is what I mentioned. For us, natural gas partially is scope 3 emissions. And so there might be, at a certain point, an additional value, or some products might have value to change that one in order to get a better footprint and get better marketable. And I guess we are still trying to find solutions for the first big topics, scope 1 and 2, before we go into the sector or even transportation is part of that, right? So, but natural gas is definitely something which is could be a differentiator, but depending on the product and depending where you are in the chemical. So we are basic, we have specialty companies where really let me say, per gram what is happening, and there you might be easier find value cases than in the basic chemical industry.
Okay, the role of the finance sector.
Do you want me to answer that from the banking side?
You from the banking side, and then maybe Equinor.
Oh, there you go.
As well.
Yeah.
You give it a shot?
Okay, I've done this for about 20 years. We use an expression in real estate. We say location, 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 right? So let's use an analogy that we used to use for financing, which is offtake, offtake, offtake. So is there going to be enough financing for these sort of projects? It depends on the offtake. What bankers want is to have a decent size offtake for that project. That's the key to it. Obviously, there are other elements like your cost of borrowing, what you're borrowing at, whether it's from the Fed or from the Bank of England and the Bank of Europe and so on, and the credit spread relative to that project. But the key thing is there going to be an offtake? And then that's where you get your financing coming through. And the financings that we've seen, at least I've seen personally on some of these projects, have not been that easy. But if there are customers for it, then you start to get the ball rolling. So that's the key premise to all of these projects taking off. The sources of liquidity in these markets have shifted away from not only the banks, but to the private equity funds and the pension funds. So they've come into the market as well to offer some of that, what we call dry powder. And I think hopefully that will continue to try and elevate some of these projects and get them off the ground and start moving. But the key thing is to having that offtake. And essentially, if you have the longer the offtake, the greater the stability of cash flows, then your debt servicing is much easier. So that's the basic answer I can give to that. I'm sorry it's very generic, but that's the basis for it. Yeah.
Chateau.
Yeah. No, I think I have a very simple approach as well. I'm educated in law, not financial structures, but I think while we're embracing for new regulation, the market still is dynamic, trying to adapt and change. I think every stone needs to be turned, how we adapt into this new situation, both the economy and the environment. But I think paramount is for everyone that we are, let's say, we are transparent, we are verifiable, and that we have an awareness of our business, what we're going, and where we're heading. We can't do more than that. And then you just need to adapt along the way. This has happened. These changes could be painful. We've seen it before with the market opening and everything. But this is where we're heading. That's what we need to relate to. And whether that's financial structures to support it or not, could be.
Have you, I mean, going to capital markets, is that for Equinor, is that a go-to source of financing for differentiated gas?
That's what my turf.
Can I just comment on the value chain piece? Because I think that's something that's quite interesting, as I've been trying to say as well, with the customer drawing information or wanting to know more about their products. And I completely agree. At the moment, we're not really set up for that kind of world. The idea is someone further up the chain sort of stuffs the information down the chain and then keep going all the way, and it ends up on a supermarket shelf with some incomprehensible number that the customer is supposed to compare and choose. And I think that's interesting in this environment where we're talking about the role of regulators and the Commission. You know, I have no idea how many CO2s my washing machine is emitting, but I know that it's got the AA mark on it, right? And I know that the other one that I could have chosen has the C, and maybe I chose the AA because it had a label and I had some confidence. Maybe I'm not total confidence, but I had some confidence that there was a testing workshop somewhere working that out for me. And I think if we're going to stimulate this market in differentiated gas, you do need that. You need something that the customer can choose on the basis. And you talk about the cracker, and maybe you have polyethylene or propylene or something coming out of the end. You know, something on the bag that I buy my carrots ready peeled or my ready lunch or whatever, which has a little A and a little picture of something being saved compared to something which doesn't have that. Maybe that's the role for regulators in trying to pull that demand, because we're all companies, right? It's a bit sad in a way, but we all do stuff for money. That's our job. We can't do stuff if there's no financial push behind it. And I think creating that push is really just a question of using the pen. Be clever about it, don't get me wrong, but we're here, this whole conference is here saying, look, we have these value chains in place, we have a way of tracing it. It's for you now to create the market for us, and maybe certain segments go first, do an analysis, of course, as to which way, but we don't need the whole market to be given a premium tomorrow, right? Let's just start somewhere that makes sense, give the customers some information, but give them a reason to have that information in a usable form. And as I say, the AAA works, the mandated amounts in end-use products works. This is something that I think, well, I would like to think Dow Chemical or one of these other customers who produces stuff for us clients in Europe could see a business case around, and that will trickle back up the chain as well, but only if we have the confidence and the right data. And I think that's where you really need the hearts and minds of the customers, that it's not just greenwashing and it's a real thing, but we have that tool. We can do that. So that's a bit my challenge to the regulators. Let's get on with it.
We're going to have to wrap up this panel in a moment. I don't think I've seen any more hands. We still have the political question, so I'd propose that we wrap up this panel with that one. Maybe Claudio, since you've laid out the greatest challenge, is how do you, I guess, interpret the current, I mean, as you've said, the regulation as it is perhaps not ideal from our perspective, but how do you interpret the current environment in terms of policymakers actually doing something about that?
Yeah, definitely. What we recognize is there is a response from the politician. And there is coming, and they are understanding now that, I mean, the competitive discussion not started yesterday, it started already years ago, right? Where we always mention that we are moving in the wrong direction, and it's not only energy costs, it's as well, let me say, other factors coming together in the moment, but it's definitely something where the chemical industry and even others are taking decision now. And that's, in my view, the reaction from politicians. They now see it serious, unfortunately maybe too late for certain capacities, but the fact is we need to do and change something. And it's not only energy costs, I totally agree, it's as well potentially over-regulation. I'm not saying methane regulation is over-regulation, but it's all these additional requirements for producers in Europe, and then the demand question and oversupply from other regions, which are definitely cost advantage. That's creating pressure not only on one area, it's a combination. And I totally agree, I guess Europe might be a landing spot for these kind of differentiated products, as Europe is driving that since years and decades, but we need to stimulate that. We need to help to move that way, and not expecting, that's my personal view, that an industry which has been built up over decades is transforming in 5 years. That's what we unfortunately see is not happening. It's going unfortunately in the wrong direction. But at least we see willingness to discuss whether this will change in competitiveness for the whole industry. We will see.
Okay, I suggest we leave it there. Thank you very much. Thank you for the questions, and thank you to the panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, So stay in your seats because we're going to continue with another keynote from Anne-Sophie Corbeau. I imagine a familiar face and name and voice to many of you. She's a global research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. Someone who comes with great expertise in, I would say, gas markets, hydrogen, LNG, all the rest of it. Has authored many papers on these topics, also looking at interactions between Europe and Asia. Co-chair of Gastech's governing body, and previously headed up gas analysis at BP prior to doing this, and has worked at numerous research bodies around the world, including the IEA and IHS Sierra as well, on these topics. So I certainly follow you in your musings, let's say, and yeah, I look forward to hearing what you've got to say at this point in time.
Thank you very much for the very kind introduction, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Indeed, this regulation on methane emission is coming at a very interesting time, especially when we know that it started really taking shape in 2020 when the European gas supply was totally different. We have been talking a lot about LNG during this conference already, but it's very important to remember that right now LNG is about 40% of our gas imports, which means that basically the rest is coming from pipeline imports, including Norway. I don't think based on the previous panel we have to worry too much about Norway, but we have also had, I think, Antoine and also Jonathan mentioning countries like Algeria, maybe Azerbaijan, gas coming also from Turkey. And it's also very marveling for me that every time we are mentioning US LNG, people are very promptly saying, oh yes, but what about the methane emissions of US LNG? The same people who are saying that we need to keep Russian pipeline gas do not mention any methane emission associated with Russian pipeline gas, which is a very interesting part of the story as well. So apparently, if we were to keep, despite the announcement from last week, Russian pipeline gas, there is no methane associated at well. Well, I'm sure the next panel, which is going to be looking at certification, may have a few things to say about that. But looking forward, the role of LNG is indeed very important because this is going to be the balancing item depending on how exactly the gas demand is going to evolve over the next years and decades. I'm very glad that the European Commission officials have mentioned that natural gas is here to stay or is not going to go away completely in the next decades. There is a S. Very important, the S. Gives us at least a little bit of visibility. But nonetheless, it doesn't give us a lot of visibility about what our new gas supply is going to look like. And in particular, the role of LNG. Because let's face it, I mean, in Europe, we are going to be in competition with the rest of the world, in particular when it comes to LNG. And I think there might be some of you here who have been involved in previous European Commission studies on how to establish and promote a flexible LNG market, flexible, transparent, and liquid LNG market. Maybe the Japanese officials may remember that actually that study started in 2017 and 18, and there was actually an MOU between Europe and Japan to look precisely at that. Well, this market and the flexibility and the transparency of this global LNG market is going to remain a very important feature for the years to come. But the role of Europe, meanwhile, has completely changed. It used to be the balancing market, and now, well, we don't really know what it is. It's kind of a more baseload market, but maybe eventually it's going to come back to what it was, a flexible market, which is why, looking at the LNG supply and this new component on top of the prices, the gas quality, the volume, so this new component, methane emission, and how to certify methane emission is going to become more and more important. The European Union is at the forefront of regulatory changes. I kind of like the differences between, the Japanese approach and the European approach. Of course, we know our approach here in Europe is very much a regulatory one. The one from Japan is more to ask the suppliers about, the different data on methane emission. I am not quite sure actually to what extent these two approaches are going to be easy to conciliate. But what is very interesting is that both Europe and Japan, and to some extent Korea, are not going to be very fast-growing market. And at the same time, we are at the very beginning of a very important wave of LNG, since LNG supply is going to increase by about 50% by the end of the decade. So you can wonder, even if Japan is joining us in this crusade to reduce methane emission, whether stable and potentially declining LNG importers are going to influence the global LNG suppliers. And though, for us, there is going to be a need for standardized and trusted certification frameworks in order to avoid a fragmentation of the world. So European buyers, as we have heard during the previous panel, are going to be looking for low methane emissions natural gas. I don't like the term low methane, by the way, because I don't know how methane can be actually low methane unless you are stripping the CH4 away from it, but that's just a comment. Anyway, we are going to be looking for this low methane emission gas, and whether we are going to be ready to pay a premium for that remains to be seen. That was discussed during the previous panel. But in any case, what do we need there? And whether we are going to lead to some sort of market fragmentation or segmentation is actually the big question. We've been talking a lot about US LNG here. Indeed, US LNG is very important. It's going to dominate the world. It is dominating the world. It's going to continue to dominate the LNG supply. Like Jonathan, I am not completely pessimistic, though, about US LNG, because I see basically this market evolving towards a bifurcated market. There are people who really want to market their low methane emission natural gas to Europe. There are also the big producers who are committed to reduce their methane emission, and I'm sure some of them are here today. But there is also the Trump fan club, doesn't care at all about methane emission. Actually, it's not even visible. So these are the people who may actually create a problem for US LNG in the future. And we published actually a blog on that a few months ago with my colleague Tim, who is, I think, sitting at the back. So this is the market that we should be looking at. But at the same time, let's not forget that the US, despite its importance, is not the only one here. I always wonder why nobody is talking about Qatar, that Jonathan mentioned. Qatar has actually the easiest gas system in the world. There is a big gas field, a few pipelines going to pretty much the same place in Ras Laffan. So they could have the opportunity to be the platinum standard of LNG and basically rob maybe the title of the best LNG to the United States. That would be kind of an interesting turn of events. But as I have recently, in a relatively provocative blog, written, what is going to be the future of LNG trade, in particular when we are looking at Europe? I titled my blog, The Future of LNG Trade, Inflexible, now I forget about how I titled, Inflexible, Polarized, and, inefficient, sorry about that. Because I am looking at different things happening here. First, the largest LNG exporter, US, is no longer talking to the largest LNG importer. Europe is about to ban Russian LNG in a few years from now. We have this methane emission coming up, which may actually be dividing the world between the dirty and the clean LNG. And finally, the Qataris are kind of at odds with some other buyers, including us, by the way, because they kind of mentioned that they could potentially stop supplying Europe if we continue with the due diligence directive. So this is creating a very interesting world that we will have to evolve into. However, I remain positive because we have ideas, we know how to adapt to a different world, and, people like Antoine have proven that, we can actually create opportunities in order for the world to better understand the attributes of the gas, as the name of the sponsors of this event says, in order to create a better gas market. But that relies upon a certification of natural gas, and in particular of methane emission, that is going to be the same for everybody, that we are all talking the same language. That's why I'm quite impatient to listen to the next panel, which is going to talk exactly about certification. Are we all talking the same language, or do we need a translation somewhere between the different countries? Thank you very much for your attention. I'm looking forward to the next panel.
Thank you very much for that. Lots of interesting thoughts and questions fitted into those 10 minutes. And indeed, you introduced our next and last panel very nicely. Are we all speaking the same language when it comes to certification? And ultimately, does the same, I guess, is the same information in understandable shape and form getting to those end customers in a way that they can make a comparison as they would like to? If we could have the final panel come up and join me here. So Thierry Mathieu, Fiji George, Teresa Bonacamp de la Peña, and Jonathan Banks. So what we want to do in this last panel is talk about, well, the certification of methane, but also the tracking or the carrying of that certification all along the value chain right up to the final customer. And so I'll do just quick intros. If we start at the end, Jonathan Banks, Global Director for Methane Pollution Prevention at CTAEF, so the Clean Air Task Force. We already heard a colleague speak from earlier. He's got a long experience working on methane, so working across the board with governments, companies, other nonprofits, and so forth, to see how to mitigate methane emissions. He's also on the board of the Clean Air Coalition. Next to him, we have Teresa Bonacamp de la Peña. So she's here representing RWE Trading, where she works on the LNG and clean fuels supply desk and origination there. Has been doing this the last couple of years, has been with RWE Trading for longer, originally with the PPA team, so I think pretty relevant. So we've already heard PPAs there's also the challenge of matching up contractual flows with actual physical flows of, well, electrons in that case, if you're talking about renewable power. Fiji George, Senior Director for Climate and Sustainability at Cheniere Energy. Also someone with a long experience in both on management side and technical side around corporate climate sustainability. Has worked right along the value chain and has worked also specifically on methane emissions as part of that. And finally, Thierry Mathieu, who joins us as a co-founder of Attributes. So he's an energy entrepreneur, has been focused for quite a few years now on the potential of blockchain as applied to the energy sector, and particularly the energy transition. Has more than 20 years experience in the energy industry, working on wind and also power trading. Has founded another company, at least one other company, but spent many years at Engie, and Attributes is actually a spin-off out of Engie, so hence the connection. So indeed, what we wanted to talk about here was to what extent or how can we very practically certify and then keep track of that, certify maybe production, maybe there's other parts of the value chain we also want to certify, basically get a certification package in place, and then move that along the value chain and get it to an end customer. So maybe if we start with you, Thierry, I'm assuming you're going to tell me that this is exactly what Attributes can deliver. So you can tell us how.
Thank
briefly.
you. I will try to answer this tricky question. First, I just want to thank Eurogas team for the quality of the organization of this event, and we are really happy to be partner of that. So very quickly, what is Attributes? Attributes is a tech solution. We have developed a web platform with the ambition to track energy data. attribute is also a team of energy experts, and I think it makes a difference for this complex topic, and we have seen the discussion until now. It's a difficult topic, and it's a difficult question to answer. There is a lot of data available. There is more and more data available. It was stated several times. And how you bring some trust into this data. It's not enough to have data. It's important to have trust into it. And that's attributes ambition. To bring this trust, and to do so, we have used the blockchain technology. By nature, it's a decentralized technology. And so it brings many aspects that are useful to bring trust down to the final user into a chain of custody. Very concretely, we started 5 years ago listening to customers, again customers. What are they interested in? And what they asked was, I want to know the origin of my gas. That was the first simple question. So that what we built, a first proposal and a first live product, where is your origin, your gas is coming from. Then we build on, as it was mentioned, there is some interest also for scope 3. Not all customers are interested yet, but it's coming. We see some interest, so we have built a second product. Today we are active in Europe and in the US, and we work also on other products, maybe a bit more complex, where you need to aggregate the origin of the green power. Is this hourly match? What is the final usage? That's all the products we are working on. What about the EU methane regulation? We follow the same way. We listen to the market. And what we've heard is, I want to be compliant. I want to carry on importing gas in Europe. How can you help for this? And so we bring our platform, a solution that would enable all the players to exchange, to bring the information. Would it be some certification from an asset? Would it be some reporting? Would it be some calculation made with a clear methodology that needs to be disclosed to? As long as it's certified by a third party, we can use our platform to bring this information to the final user. We need that to be at ease in carry on importing gas. We are starting simple, and our flexibility in the platform, our ambition is clearly to accompany the rollout of the methane regulation and to be able to add when there are some more clarity on different points to be able to answer that too.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I think that's a good introduction. Fiji, let's go to you. So we haven't had anyone from the Department of Energy here, so you're probably the closest thing we have to someone somehow connected to the US. And we've talked a lot about US LNG, so I guess at this point everyone's interested in just hearing a bit from you as to how you see the European market, the EU methane regulation, and how are you dealing with the US administration? Kind of what's your, what are you up to these days?
To clear the record, I'm not from the government, okay? And I'm here to help you. Okay, so let me start. So thanks for the kind introduction. I work for Cheniere, and I want to first thank Andres and his team. They've done a wonderful job. Please give them a round of applause, because I've been in this business for about 30 plus years doing methane emission science and policy, and this is one of the best conferences with a confluence of a variety of minds. So I must give hats off to you, Andres. So just to give a quick background for folks who do not know Cheniere, we are the largest LNG exporter out of the United States. Our current capacity is 45 million tons. We're growing to 55 million tons when Corpus Christi Stage 3 is completed, so it'll be done soon. What is also interesting in context of Cheniere our two liquefaction terminals, Sabine Pass and Corpus, accounted for 25% of the LNG imports to the EU 27 in 2024. So 25%, quarter of all the LNG that was imported by the EU came from our facilities. What's also really important is we're not simply a tolling entity. We buy the gas, and we are, on any given day, the largest buyer of natural gas in the United States. We consume approximately 7 to 8% of the total gas produced in the United States. 7 to 8%. Those are huge numbers for context. So with that context of Cheniere, and I wanted to give you how we got here and the solutions that I'm going to propose. I joined the company in 2018, started the Climate and Sustainability Program, but about 5 to 6 years ago in this same city, there was a discussion on how do we regulate methane for imports. And that sort of was one of the drivers or a business case that I went back to management and convinced them to invest in measurements across their supply chain. Remember, we got a massive supply chain. We got 100 different counterparties we buy gas from. We have 138 different ways we bring gas to Sabine and Corpus. So we started engaging. We did actual measurement studies with our partners, our supply chain partners, not just the producers, but all the way to our ships. We also got into analysis on how do we model these daily emission purchases that we do? How do we account for emissions from the cargo that leaves the terminals? So that led into 11 peer-reviewed studies published in top-tier scientific journals like the American Chemistry Society. In one of our seminal work is where we do supplier-specific pathing. That is, we can trace all the way from our Sabine and Corpus plants all the way to the producer and the producer basin. So like the colleague before from Anji said, this co-mingling stuff is not a big deal for us. Now, what did we learn from our studies? So one, no surprise, when you do measurements, the emissions are higher. Number two, the measurements between these 138 different pathways I mentioned are significantly different. In fact, there's a 600% difference between our highest and lowest production pathways. So that's another thing. The other point is, even within the same production basin, there was a 100% difference. So all this leads to the point of you need to get supplier-specific assessment done. Now, let's go back to the EU rule, and what does it say? The EU rule tells under Chapter 5 for the importers, so remember, we're not an importer, Cheniere is not an importer, but the importer has to get data from the producers that are comparable to the MRV rules in the EU. So for importers, you got to do level 5 OGMP measurements, and very important, people forget this, you need to have third-party verification under reasonable assurance standards. For those of you who do not know what reasonable assurance standard is, talk to your named officer who signs the SEC report. That is what a KPMG or one of those entities would do. So it's a totally different standard. It's not the voluntary PR stuff that people do now. It is completely different. So remember these two things. So when we look at it from our perspective, when we tackled our experience, and we have been issuing 1,400, we have so far issued 1,400 cargo emission tags. And cargo emission tags gives you the methane intensity of our supply chain, including at the producer level, to our customers. So these have been already done. This has been done since 2022. And some of these have been redesigned to support Annex 9 reporting for our customers. And this has been done completely voluntarily from Cheniere. So our recommendation to make life easy for all of us, because the EU rule requires data for the importer from producers, they have no connection, they have to be much more simplified. The methodology that we use in our cargo emission tag would be one way to do it. And also remember, you will have producers who are members of OGMP. If you look at the OGMP record for the US, there are 26 producers accounting for about 38% of the total US production. So not all producers participate in OGMP. So it's good to think that everybody will do level 5, but there is no motivation for that for many operators. So a majority, you got to assume that will not be doing level 5. So how do you get their data? And the recommendation we are making is the recommendation that is done in the state of Colorado by Dan Zimmerly and team at Colorado State University, where they use publicly available data. You've heard about EDF's methane sat, you've heard about carbon map, private companies doing other measurements. These data can be collated and analyzed by independent scientific experts to come up with basin level estimates, and then you use geospatial data to assign those values to individual producers. So in that way, you have proxy MRVs from operators who are not part of OGMP, allow them time to get into OGMP level 5, and then you may have some who are with OGMP members. That data needs to be put into, he used blockchain. I know that's a loaded word. Some use Canton networks, some use, I'll just use the simple thing. I'm not an IT person, so I'll use distributed ledger. Put it into a distributed ledger, make sure it meets all the immutable standards, the provenance standards, and then it's delivered to the importer, where you have one number that is delivered, as opposed to be delivering maybe 100,000 data points, because the EU rule requires level 5 measurements at every well site.
So you have found a way to basically deal with that requirement.
We are recommending.
A way. Well, you have found a way that recommending is adopted.
Yeah, we found a way. It's practical. It allows verification, assurance. It keeps. We think it's sort of the best of both worlds.
I've got maybe, some follow-ups, but I'd like to go to Teresa first. I guess more from a practical trading perspective. So a lot is possible, is what I'm taking from these first two speakers. I guess not everything that is possible is necessarily desirable. It gets more complicated. How do you approach this, I guess, from a trading perspective? What are you looking for, and where do you see potential problems of kind of mapping, overlaying all of these attributes onto kind of a functioning a gas trading market?
Mm-hmm. No, thank you, Sonia, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak. And I must say I agree a lot with all that you said, Fiji. I think we have similar views. Just to set the scene a little bit, I work in the LNG desk, where we trade around 20 million tons of LNG per year. We roughly trade 50% in the Pacific and 50% in the Atlantic. And we're, and important to Europe, and especially into Germany, where we have a very direct link through German LNG, where we have equity stake, but also long-term capacity, and where we supported with the whole FSRU situation. And I was also planning on giving you a bit more perspective from the commercial side. How is all this methane regulation really impacting the negotiations we're having with our suppliers? And there's a few points, at the risk of sounding obvious, maybe when we look at our entire portfolio, just to make clear that it's from the beginning a challenge to always know the source. So, and especially in the US, I'm interested to speak with you later a bit more in detail, but sometimes the exporter doesn't even know the source of production. Let alone when you have a spot cargo that you buy from a trader that maybe has changed hands a few times. And there it's only possible to know the source once the cargo is regasified. So that in itself is a challenge. And then when we're negotiating now the long-term contracts, it's not always easy to embed this clause that the producer will have to comply with a future regulation that we don't know how it will look like. And we do see a risk that the contracts are being hindered, and that the producers have a perfectly good option to divert the cargo somewhere else to less regulated markets, and that we, as Europe, that we are placed in a disadvantaged position. And coming down to the certification, we believe this is a really good solution. We're working with some certifying bodies, with MIQ and others. And we also have certified a cargo from start to finish. And the risk that we're seeing is that we're trying to overcomplicate a bit the whole certification. We believe that maybe taking into account that this is sometimes an investment for a small producer to set up all the measurement in place and so on, they may lack this incentive to be measuring methane emissions only to satisfy Europe requirements. So the easier we can put it for them, the better. And just an idea would be to decouple the certificate from the molecule, so to have a bit more flexibility that you can buy a cargo from the US, and in case they don't know the exact source, that you can buy a certificate from another producer, as long as it's in the same geographical area under a certain timescale, that you don't use a certificate that was produced 5 years ago. But to make it a bit more flexible, at least in the short term, until we reach the gold standard that, of course, we need to aim for, but to make it more actionable in the short term.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Okay, Jonathan, the risk of greenwashing, I'm just thinking, picking up particularly on if we're decoupling molecules from certificates, I imagine that risk is introduced. At the same time, it sounds like, well, attributes and Cheniere too, there is a lot possible in terms of tracking, and certainly Cheniere says, they're working down the supply chain with producers. They have the information, are using public data to cross-reference that, to come up with proxies where necessary. It's possible. So I guess, is this as good as it gets? Are there specific things you're concerned about? How do you see, I guess, the possibility of having the necessary certifications in place and those traveling down the value chain in a way that we don't have to be massively worried about greenwashing, and basically that this can work as a means of ultimately mitigating methane emissions?
Well, first, just short answer, it's completely and totally doable. But I want to step way, way back for a couple of seconds. Because a lot of these panels, we've started off the conversation forgetting why we're actually doing this. And the reason we're doing this is because climate change is here, the impacts are here. Everything we are doing right now on CO2, electrification, driving electric cars, buying renewable energy, none of that is going to have an impact in bending the curve on climate change for anyone in this room. Zero. The only thing that is going to have any impact in slowing the rate of warming and the impacts that we will feel is reductions in methane. So we need to step back and say, why are we doing this? It's not about finding new markets. It's not about any of this stuff. I know your companies and you all have to make money, and that's very important. But at the end of the day, the most important thing is that we have a livable planet. And I think we sometimes forget that because we get stuck so far down into the details of how all of this works. But let's now go back down into the details, because it totally will work. And Fiji's right. I mean, this is not about tracing the molecules. This is about following the money. And we know darn well that we can follow the money. We've been following the money on gas trades ever since they started trading gas. The molecules don't have to be followed, but the trades do. All we have to do is attach to the trades the environmental attributes of the gas that we're moving around the world, and we can do this. We've been working with a number of folks, with Fiji and others. I'm not saying Fiji endorses everything we agree to, but we've been working with a number of companies around the world to develop systems that will actually get us to the point where we really have strong validation of the emissions that are associated with the gases actually delivered. You have to have a plausible pathway between the gas that's being produced and the gas that's being delivered. I don't think we want to be in a situation where we are decoupling the environmental attributes from the gas. That's not a place that I think we want to go into. It's not that difficult to do this system of trace and claim or a variation along the lines of what Fiji's talking about, where you are following the money down from the producer all the way to the delivered product. I want to hit on a couple of things that have come up over the course of today. The first is just on data quality versus provenance. I mean, like right now, what we're talking about is not, you don't have to do OGMP level 5 today. You have to deliver the data that you have. You have to say whether or not the data comes from OGMP or it comes from somewhere else. And you have to say what, if anything, you've done on mitigation. That's what we have to do today. MRV, good MRV is going to take some time to get there. We know that, but we do have a little bit of time to get there. But we can deal with we can create a system that can deal with these issues, and as the MRV improves, it can be attached to these trades as we move along. The second point is, the existing markets can handle this. We are trading, attributes already of gas all over the world. This is just simply attaching another attribute along the lines of what Fiji is talking about. Third, none of what we're talking about, especially right now with the current requirements under the law, should present any problems in securing contracts. I mean, you're literally required to report the data that you have. Longer term contracts, people have come to us and said, well, we don't have any clarity on that. Well, there is clarity, actually, if you want it. It's OGMP level 5. So there is clarity, and there will be more clarity coming in the future. But there is a pathway forward on this. And the cost of getting the data are going to be marginal compared to what you might hear based on the conversations in the room here. Those costs of getting the data are not going to send gas to Japan. They're not going to send gas that was destined to Europe to South Korea. These are marginal costs that will not impact that. I mean, if you're changing a shipment that's going from the Gulf Coast to go from the Gulf Coast to Asia instead of going to here, the boil off in LNG, the fuel costs for the ship, the chartering costs, all of that are exponentially more than the cost of trying to get decent data. So this is not going to lead to any sort of rerouting of shipments to other parts of the world. And it's not going to lead to any sort of energy security problems. The final thing I would say maybe is just we are headed into a world, likely very soon, where there's a lot more gas than potentially is needed, where the market potentially is flooded. The things that we do in regards to the methane standard, both on the MRV side of things and then eventually on actually reducing emissions, those are the kind of things that are going to be critically necessary for companies to be able to differentiate themselves in the world. And having valid attributes that say, yes, this gas is lower methane gas, those will be the things that will differentiate yourself in the market. And it's not just going to be Europe. Japan's looking at this, South Korea's looking at this, but we have countries all over the world that are working towards methane policies, both importing and exporting countries. This is not Europe in isolation. This is something that's being done around the world, and it's completely and totally doable.
Okay, thank you very much for that. A few points to follow up. Maybe Fiji, I'd come back to you. Do you? I guess a quick comment. So we heard differing views to some extent on to what extent the existing market copes, and is there a potential for trading to be rerouted, diverted? So maybe a quick comment from you. Is that, as Jonathan says, and the methane emissions regulation would never or not be cause for any form of rerouting, and maybe the question behind that is, you're interested in selling to Europe. Why, and could anything change that? And the second question is, when it comes to sourcing all this data, especially as we go forward, are there points we are already coming up against or foresee will come up against the limits of confidentiality in terms of getting emissions from producers, or are you going to be able to supply everything that we think the Commission is going to want to see? Maybe start with those two questions.
So 2 questions, would there be rerouting? And number 2 is the confidentiality.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm a climate science and policy guy. Okay, so I don't, I'm not in the commercial space, but I work with a lot of guys in the commercial side. So my point of view is we, over the past 6 months, have been getting a lot of Annex 9 requests from customers both based in the EU and outside EU. And so I coined a term called contagion effect of the EU rules, which is basically everybody would need this. And if you look at the Cheniere contracts, we are pioneers and innovators in how we've come up with some new contracts, which is destination-free contracts. So you may have an Asian customer who sees a high arbitrage in Europe, wants to deliver into Europe, but now needs the methane data. So perhaps in an unintended way, it is leading to quasi-standardization while the Clean Initiative is going on. So that's one point. Now, what is the cost of doing this? And this is why I emphasize the need for proxy MRV, because not every producer will be motivated to do it because the existing gas contracts do not require it. 97% of Cheniere's contracts, gas purchasing contracts, that is feed gas purchasing contracts, are long-term. We know who the producers are, we know who our counterparties are, right? 97%, and generally they're longer-term, i.e. greater than 1 month. Duration can vary. We have other type of contracts, which are IPM contracts, where we give the producer international exposure. Those are 10 to 15 years. So how much and how much cost it would be, we need to review it based once the regulations are set, right? What is level 5? Cheniere is the only US LNG company that is an OGMP 2.0 member, and our level 5 emissions reports are being certified. There's a cost for it, right? You talk about producers, there's a cost for doing this. If you're asking them to do at every well site, it is tremendous cost. By the way, OGMP 2.0 does not require you to do measurements at every well site. You just need to do it as a statistical representative stuff. So once the rules are defined, and this is why we need certainty, and this is why Cheniere endorses the Eurogas letter on liability, right? There are concerns. What happens if the producer cannot do measurements or the importer cannot give all the data? So we do not know the cost. So what Cheniere's proposed is a practical solution that reduces administrative burden and hopefully reduces cost. And I know at least half a dozen technology platforms, including attributes, that can do the MRV on a digital ledger basis, where someone in Brussels can check the intensity of the supply of cargo. So that is there. Okay. But we need the rules to be written. Now all we have is a framework, right? OGMP level 5 is a framework. So how do we get these things codified in rule? And depending on that, if you gold plate it, yes, there's an extreme cost. If you do it more reasonably, then it could be done better, especially if you socialize these measurements using existing data from EDF and Carbon Map or public data, right? Yeah. The cost reduces, and this is what we need to really understand. How can we use existing scientific research done by independent scientists, not hacks like me, but done by independent scientists who would do the stuff, get the trust in. And verification is the bedrock of trust. I completely subscribe to that theory.
And what, maybe and then I'll come to the others, but as a follow-up, well, obviously a logical follow-up to that, what is the impact of the current administration's, I guess, direction of travel to move away from reporting on and mitigating methane? Does that affect your company's strategy? Sure. Does it affect, I guess, those of the producers you work with, and what's potentially the knock-on effect on you? So how do you experience that?
So from our perspective, our management has been very clear that we will continue our current road. Many of our suppliers have said that. I cannot speak on their behalf on what their strategy will be going forward. But hopefully, we see the value. You know, the EPA rules have been in place for over 12 years, and people know how to do it and how to handle it. The challenge now is that is different. That is called level 3. When you do the measurement, that is level 5. That's a whole different animal. And so that is something. Now, whether the administration keeps it or does not keep it, I think most of us, you know, will continue to chug along.
Okay, thank you. Thierry, I wanted to come back to you with a question on. So we have the emerging, we have the EU methane regulation, but we have differing. Cheniere has its own approach as well, recommendation to feed into that. So there's multiple standards, measurements, ways of ultimately certifying and then presumably tracking all of this. How we're very far from, I guess, one standardized global system. Does that matter? And how do you as a company, I guess, reconcile and come up with something which end customers can compare? And also maybe how do you, I guess, what can you offer customers at a point in time where there is still a lot of uncertainty and not everything has been worked out in detail? How can you nonetheless offer them something that ultimately promises regulatory compliance?
We cannot.
Okay, that was easy.
Let's be clear, we cannot offer sure compliance with a regulation which is just starting. And as just mentioned earlier on, there are many ways of answering the framework set by European Commission. So the idea is to bring different options, and for us, what makes sense is to have a repository to start with what we know, where you will have to be transparent. If you use a certain label with a certain methodology to calculate your methane emission, but not only, it can be other value that could be of interest, then it needs to be brought into the system. Would you have, as Cheniere, a specific methodology? You need to expose also this methodology, and then to have to be aligned with what is for now. What we know is that you need a certification. Would OGMP already be certified by design? Still, maybe to be fully agreed by Europe. But what we have been told is that we will learn by doing, by going forward. So our solution is really bring some information. We can put that into a distributed ledger. So there is an auditability trail that can be as potentially checked by Europe. Maybe it can help for confidentiality issues. If you have your contract there but not known by anyone, and that the Commission or a country wants to check for several cargoes exactly how it was calculated, it's dated, it's into a repository where it cannot be changed. Then if we go further, the ambition is also to help for easy things as what you need to report. For what we understand now, the format from the OGMP will be the one used as a transition. So you can have some different source of documentation, and we help to bring that into the similar format to ease the process to report for the different entities. Okay. But that's a start, and clearly there will be more. We can also help on the double counting issue, but all that needs transparency. If you have different registry, you need to have a clear statement. I'm using this registry, not several, to avoid any double counting. So that's the way we answer the question.
Okay, thank you. We'll open for questions in a moment. Teresa, I wanted to give you a chance to come back too on, I guess, what some of the other people have said, and especially Jonathan, who, I guess, challenged some of the points you made and said, well, you know, yeah, we don't see a risk of diversion. We don't see a risk to contracts being closed. I mean, I guess your experience may be different, so maybe just come back on that. what we heard from the others.
Thank you. Yes, I was thinking maybe the solution lies somewhere in the middle. So I don't think we're not going to be able to close contracts. It's definitely slowing them down, and we do see some parties being reticent to simply complying to something where they have other options that are less complicated and more used to what they're doing, and maybe they wouldn't reroute to South Korea, but there are other options like South America and India that maybe could be options. And it depends which producer and how much would be the cost of the reporting, and especially when looking a bit more into the future, when the threshold of methane emissions becomes a bit more, becomes tangible, and also let's see how high that threshold is. So yeah, that's definitely something a bit open at the moment. Also, another point that I wanted to make regarding the proxy for certificates, that maybe we could simplify somewhere along the value chain by adding the emissions as a proxy. So I think that's a really good idea, to just have default values for the pipeline, for the liquefaction, for the shipping, and that simply had a certificate in the end with all the information relating to the methane emissions, and that could be treated as a green premium, where some European parties would be able to pay a bit more for the LNG. Also, as Anne-Sophie mentioned in the panel before, sort of low carbon, higher quality methane, for example.
Okay, thank you. Are there questions? Yeah, I can see 2 hands here. I think those are the only 2 I see at the moment. So let's, over there as well, the third one. Yeah, go ahead.
So just
tell us who you are briefly.
Yes, sorry. I'm Mursh Zara. I'm co-chairing the methane emissions working group in the European Gas Research Group. So we are working a lot on the new technologies, etc. And just to speak to what Fiji just mentioned, I think this proxy approach is a little bit of a double-edged sword, because on one hand side it helps to comply, and we heard from Teresa that you just get the stamp on the paper and you're good. But to me, the other side of the coin is that defeats totally the purpose of MRV, because MRV is there just to help operators understand where they have their emissions in order to mitigate them. So let's not forget that MRV is there. It's just the first step of the approach. The actual stake is to know where your emissions are and get rid of them. So let's see this as let's say a transition. You mentioned measurements, so as soon as you have relatively localized measurements that help you understand where you need to act. But let's not forget that the priority is to act and cut emissions.
Okay, yeah, thank you. If we go back, yeah, and then we'll go across.
Hi, my name is George Tabers from MIQ. We certify already today about 20% of the gas in the United States of, in fact, actually the quality that Fiji is talking about, of reasonable assurance. My question to the panel is, the EUMR is quite specific. It talks about production level MRV. However, if we want to address methane, like I totally agree there with you, Jonathan, it's one of the biggest things we can do this decade, in my view. We have to talk about the full supply chain emissions. But unfortunately, in my view, it's not in the methane regulations. Panel's thoughts about that, and how can we square that?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and the third question comes from me, Axel Scheuer, Energy Climate Policy Advisory, Europe. I heard in the prior panel and from the European Commission representatives from Kitty, the EU methane regulation is not up for renegotiation. And there's, the Commission is looking at the industry to come up with pragmatic implementation solutions. So the ball has been played a little bit into the court of the industry, and there will be different and various implementation solutions and compliance solutions. That's a little bit in contrast to what I heard here, the follow the money approach, the trace and claim, which is a great concept to send direct incentives to producers. But is that possible, this follow the money, without additional regulation? Isn't there additional and probably more global concepts to be rolled out in order to impose that on value chains, on supply chains?
Okay, thank you. Okay, final question.
Thank you. Very quick one. Jesse Finidori from Odol. First of all, thank you very much, Eurogas Energy Booth, for this very, very good event. Quick question. I would like to know and to clarify who owns the data. Because in my domain, from the blockchain industry, you have the digital asset to transfer the ownership. It's quite clear. You have the natural gas producer, they transfer their data to LNG exporter, they transfer to maybe RWE. At the end, who owns the data? Who is the legitimate owner of this data? Thank you for the clarification.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I've seen you at the back. Is your question short? We're not going to have much time to answer them.
I can make it very short.
Okay, do that.
Matthias Frank, ExxonMobil. So I'm engineer by background, and from that, if I'm not mistaken, as soon as you mix two sources in one commingled system, you're not able to trace any molecule anymore. So could the panel please confirm that whatever approach is being developed will only be an approximation and really the objective to give the producer an incentive? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I haven't got much time left, so I think what I'll do is run down the panel and answer what you feel able to answer. You don't all have to answer everything, and we'll see. Hopefully everything will be answered by the time I end up back with Thierry. Jonathan, do you want to start?
With 1 minute and 30 seconds, this could be
Oh,
interesting.
no, you can take a minute. We can go 1 or 2 minutes over.
Okay, let me just see if I can do that last one relatively quickly, which the answer would be mass balance. So basically where you have a commingling of gas, you have a certain number of environmental attributes that come into the commingling point. You're only allowed to sell out a certain number, that same amount of attributes. Yes, you're not tracking the exact molecules, but again, we don't have to track the molecules. What you're trying to track is that you're getting all of those environmental attributes in some form or fashion delivered to the end. So I think mass balance is the answer there, and we've got a paper that you can look at if you want more information on that. So I'll be quiet.
Okay, thank you. Teresa, is there one that you can pick up on?
Well, just partially that if the MRV does not include the methane emissions in supply chain, just that it certainly should. So I assume it's going to be extended, and that's like the second tier objective.
Okay, let me talk about the commingling. There is a 2024 paper by us. Our entire algorithm, our secret sauce, is in the paper. And we've been doing this since 2022, so it's not a big deal. Cheniere's got a lot of IPM contracts. If I have to sell 140,000 a day of EOG IPM gas abroad, I cannot guarantee that I'm getting EOG gas over there, but the trade's happening. So so basically Jonathan's point, follow the money. This whole commingling, I think, is a distraction, but let's focus on the real issue, which is how do we get this done in a reasonable manner, cost-effective manner, where we meet the intent of the rule, not the letter of the rule. I think the letter of the rule as structured will be very difficult. Quickly, to your question on proxy MRV, I'm not talking about a default number for the entire country, but a number computed by the most prominent scientists in the world for every producer in that basin. And this has already been done in the state of Colorado by Dan Zimmerly and his team. He's got a white paper out. And for those of you, shameless plug, next Monday, there's an IEA conference. I'll be talking more about it.
And maybe there is a market who works quite well for maybe more than 25 years. On green power, you have no ability to follow electrons. For the gas market, it's the same. You cannot follow molecules, and it's not even making sense. And you can buy today green power for my house. I can pay a premium and have some green power. I don't know if I have green power, but what I know is that some green power has been injected in the similar network. And a regulator is taking care of that. So to answer the question, yes, it's mixed, it's commingled, but it's not an issue. It can be tackled. And second, who is owning the data? That's the same for green power. If you have an asset, the right that you're transferring is not the data itself. Who cares about data? What you are buying is the ability to claim that you are the one using this electricity, this gas with these attributes attached to it. And that's the difference. But you are not buying the fact that you are concretely burning this gas using these electrons.
Okay, thank you. I suspect we probably haven't fully answered the question on do we need more regulation, supply chain, also regulation around methane emissions in the supply chain, but I suspect we haven't got anyone up here, I would say, who is probably equipped to answer that.
I can answer that because I handle the entire supply chain. So,
can you? And whether we need more, and expect more, want more, or need more, will get more regulation?
No, so to be clear, if you go to our scientific papers, okay, and this is clear, production segment accounts for about 35% of the, from production to shipping. So production, gathering, boosting, processing, transmission, liquefaction, shipping. Methane emissions about 35 to 40%. That's roughly it. So the EU rules do not cover about 65% of the emissions in the supply chain. So I agree with what George was saying, right? This is TBD.
May come. Yeah.
But our cargo tag covers the entire supply chain. We also give you partial data to our customers on production data too.
Okay, thank you. I think we have to leave it there. Thank you. A round of applause for our panel. We've got two final speakers for you before we wrap up at 6. So I'd like to invite up Jutta Paulus, here from the European Parliament, a member of the ENVI Committee, TRAN Committee, ITRE Committee. She's with the German Greens, has been in the Parliament since 2019, has worked across a lot of issues, but notably was also rapporteur on the EU methane regulation. So very curious to hear, I guess, what you take away from all these discussions and how you see the future of methane regulation. Go ahead.
Thank you. Well, thank you for having me, and I think everyone is already a bit, let's say, overwhelmed or tired by everything they have heard today. I can clear up one of the mysteries which was just mentioned. Why doesn't the EU methane regulation cover the full supply chain when it comes to imports? It's very simple. There wasn't a political majority for that. Of course, I would have loved to have it in, but the Council of Member States was adamant that this would not be possible and this would create additional burden. I mean, to be very honest, when I started negotiations on that file, I didn't believe that we would, at the end of the day, manage to include the imports in the first place. And when we concluded the negotiations that night, I was, let's say, very happy that we managed to get imports in, but also a bit disappointed that it would take so long. Because let's not forget, the MRV obligation will only enter into force in 2027. So saying, oh, we can't conclude contracts, I'm not sure. I mean, you should be able, within 2 years' time, to read a paper and do what's written there. Because right now we are only talking about monitoring and reporting verification of emissions. It's not like you have to do the LDAR. Of course, I would have loved to, that importers would also do the leak detection and repair as we're imposing it on our European producers. You don't even have to mitigate your emissions. I mean, you would be pretty stupid to not to, because when you know where you're losing money, every molecule you're losing, you won't be able to sell it anymore. I mean, it's pretty logical. But the obligation for 2027 is MRV only. And as was rightfully said, quite a few of the producers in the US are OGMP members in the first place, so they should be obliged to do it anyhow. Where I am on the same page about the uncertainty about the benchmark, because obviously the Commission can only set a benchmark for importers when they know what our own domestic production is emitting, because else we would get some difficulties with the WTO rules. So obviously we cannot impose something on our importers which we are not doing ourselves. So the Commission said, well, right now we have to work with guesstimates because we don't know the real emissions, and we will not be able to calculate the benchmark if we don't have the real emissions, which is why this takes so long. And I'm sort of, let's say, happy to hear that the guesstimates which have been replaced in your company were much lower than the actual emissions that you have measured along your value chain, which maybe also explains why all those numbers which are brought forward to the IPCC by the various countries are quite low if you look at the actual numbers which we have. I do have a problem with the default values that were mentioned, even if they are on a regional scale, because you, shortly before you said, I left my paper over there, but I put the numbers down, that in a region within the different producers, you had differences of 600%. And within the same producers, time-wise, you had variations of 100%. So which default value should we pick? The average one? Then we wouldn't give any incentive for doing MRV. So in my view, if you want this simplification, which would be sort of deregulation also in that case, then of course the default value should be dissuasively high. So basically looking at the worst performer in that region, and you get that value unless you prove that you're better. And I think that would be the right way forward, because saying, hey, we'll give you the average value, then of course those that maybe already know that they're not doing too well would say, okay, great, I like this value, I don't have to invest, and I'm even faring better than if I were actually doing my homework. But I want to get back to what I'm terrible with numbers. No, not with numbers, with names. I'm terrible with names. What Jonathan has said about why are we actually doing this. When I was negotiating that file, I spoke to a lot of people, of course, also to Mr. Scheuer back there, but also to many, many other producers, suppliers, importers, exporters, scientists, and I also took a trip to Paris and went to visit the International Energy Agency. And I asked Fatih Birol, listen, you know that we're negotiating this, and I've been asked what kind of impact would it actually make on the global climate? And he said, oh, that's a good question. We'll have to do some calculations, we'll get back to you. And so some weeks later, I got an email and they said, okay, let's just assume that all the countries where the EU is importing gas from would say, hey, we want to keep that market. We'll either have a legislative action or our producers will behave because they don't want to lose the biggest market in the world, which pays the best prices. Good point. Let's just assume that everyone would be doing it. Then we would end up at yearly CO2 equivalent emissions savings of 400 megatons, which is 2/3 of the emissions of the whole of Germany. If you just calculate 80 times methane intensity as compared to CO2 in a 20-year time frame. So this little legislation is one of the most far-reaching legislations that we have done within the whole Green Deal. If we look at the global action it can actually bring forward. Not, of course, talking about the additional benefits for the regions. Do you know that wording Cancer Alley? Do you know where it comes from? It's those regions at the Gulf Coast where the very poor people are living, where a lot of pollution is coming from venting, from flaring, from all the pollution that the oil and gas plants, liquefaction, whatever, is doing there. And this Cancer Alley is not an invention. I mean, it's documented in studies that people living there are much, much more prone to develop cancer, to develop pulmonary diseases, which of course comes with methane, as methane is not only a climate-active gas, but it's also a pollutant. So this is not even factored in when we're talking about climate. And last but not least, I've heard a lot these days, since I'm negotiating the Security of Supply Initiative report, about energy security. And wouldn't this regulation impede our energy security because it would have a dissuasive effect? Well, as we learned, it's not a good idea to leave aside the biggest market in the world where you can actually ship your gas to and get very good prices. It's also that every molecule that is not wasted can be used to actually ensure our energy supply. And during the gas crisis in 2022, I saw another impressive number coming from the Commission saying, if all the MENA region, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, would be doing what's in this regulation, we would be able to cover from what is saved there 15% of what Russia is delivering to Germany. And Germany was dependent to 50% from Russian gas, 50%. Now we're like 12 or 13 still, but that was a huge, huge effort, and it has cost my country a lot of money. It was managed, but just to think that part of this could have been managed at virtually no net cost simply by not venting and flaring in a region not even 2,000 kilometers far is really unbelievable. So let's get to work. I'm happy that at least part of the industry is on board, and I think at the end of the day we will ask ourselves, well, why did we wait for legislation in the first place?
Thank you. Thank you very much for a very pertinent and I think forward-looking, inspiring note to end on. I'm going to invite up Andreas Gut to give us the response, I guess the industry response, hopefully equally inspiring response to that. So, Secretary General of Eurogas.
Well, thank you indeed. For me, really interesting discussion and conference, so thank you all for being part of this. And Sonja, thank you for this excellent moderation. You've really managed to ask the right questions on most of the occasions. I think you got pretty good answers. On some of them, perhaps worth digging a little bit deeper. Of course, to all the speakers, thank you for your excellent contributions. And a big thanks to our sponsor, Attributes. I'm not actually sure where you're sitting in the room, but of course, without you, this wouldn't have been possible in the first place. So why did we choose to organize this conference? And it's actually something where I can agree with Jonathan and Jutta. This is important. It is an absolute no-regret option. We need to tackle methane emissions, and I don't think anybody in this room believes otherwise. As the IEA put it out, the numbers are still way too high. And as Christian mentioned in this opening, it's also a question of credibility of the gas sector. So we believe gas will be part of the energy transition for quite some time, so it is an obligation that we make sure that the environmental credentials are as good as possible. And if anybody has any doubt about this, we also have other legislation coming up, like the Low Carbon Delegated Act to produce hydrogen. We need to be progressively tracing environmental attributes of natural gas, whether we like it or not. And having said all of that, I can still say the following, is that the methane emission regulation poses very significant challenges. And this does already impact the market today. And that's not to say that it's not an important piece of legislation, but we cannot ignore the reality that it is a challenge. And actually, it is something that Jonathan Stern mentioned. I don't know if you actually noticed it. He mentioned it very, very briefly, that the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies is going to look at the challenge of independent verifications. This is a fundamental requirement in order to be complying with this regulation. We're starting to look at this now. There are still so many unanswered questions about this legislation, and we've had long discussion about traceability, so I won't label that point. But there are many elements that are missing from this piece of legislation. It is a framework. It doesn't give us all the answers. I know I'm the last person preventing you from having drinks, but there are so many things I've actually noted down, so many points from this discussion, but this has an impact on negotiations. It is obvious. Whether it prevents a negotiation from being concluded or whether it just makes it significantly more difficult is another question, and probably depends on the company. The other point I've heard quite a lot is that the cost of mitigating methane emissions is negligible or limited. And I'm not really competent to judge whether that is correct or not, but let's assume it is. But that's not really the key problem that we're facing. It's not the cost of mitigating methane emissions. It is the uncertainty that the legislation poses for importers. And this is something that was mentioned earlier. It's actually what drives costs today is supply and demand. It's supply imbalance, and we are, with this regulation, limiting the pool of available supplies that we can draw on at the worst possible time. And so this is where we're coming from in this debate. We recognize that this is fundamental and important. We also understand that this is currently, as it is designed, not working, and more needs to be done, and that requires, of course, not just regulators and policymakers. This also requires an industry effort. And we are ready, and I think this conference shows it. And again, I have to thank Jonathan Stern for your comment. You know, industry is good speaking to ourselves. I think with this conference, we've shown that, you know, we do better than that. We've been able to inspire quite a diverse discussion. We've had many different audiences, also from Cleaner Task Force. And here, perhaps also a thank you to you, because you're also very proactive in this debate, like us, and you know, very happy to engage with you, and very happy for the conference that you're organizing next week. This is the kind of discussion that we need, but I think we also really need to recognize and be honest that there's still a lot of work going forward. And this is why we are advocating for what we have been advocating. Because ultimately, the main challenge is, at the moment, the question of liabilities that is extremely challenging for companies to sort out when you're faced with up to 20% of your annual turnover as a penalty, with all the remaining uncertainties that we have.
Where do you have the 20%
from the regulation, it's Article...
Member States may.
Up to, indeed. So, but it's a question mark. It's not yet defined. So how do you comply with even a liability that isn't defined yet? You proved my point. But anyway, I think... So I think I'll leave it with that, but I do have to thank, of course, I'm skipping through most of this because I think we can have many more discussions over the drinks. So thanks especially, of course, also to the team for making all of this possible. Sarah, Kathleen, Connie, thanks so much. And with that, please stay for the drinks. Thank you so much for your participation, and looking forward to see you at our next events, in this case, the Renewable Gas Barbecue and Conference.